Story 1. In the midst of the lush, verdant expanse of the forest, where the light of the sun barely pierced through the dense canopy overhead, I discovered an abandoned cabin. It was an eerie, unplanned detour on my solo hiking trip, driven by a curious blend of intrigue and an unsettling sense of dread. The path that led me there was less a trail and more an accidental break in the underbrush, hidden by overgrown ferns and the fallen limbs of ancient trees. As I approached, the cabin seemed to emerge from the forest itself, its wooden planks weathered and moss-covered, blending into the landscape as though it had grown organically from the earth. The air around it was heavy with the scent of mold and decay. A slight chill ran through me as I stepped onto the creaking porch, pausing to consider the wisdom of entering such a place alone. Inside, the cabin was shrouded in shadows, the light from the door revealing only fragments of the dusty interior. Old furniture lay scattered and overturned, the remnants of a life once lived here now surrendered to time. In the dim light, my eyes settled on a small, leather-bound journal resting atop a crooked table. It was as if the cabin had exhaled its secrets into this book, leaving everything else to silence. Compelled by an insatiable curiosity, I brushed off the cover and opened the journal to the first page. The entries began innocuously enough, with notes about daily chores, the weather, and observations of the local wildlife. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone of the entries shifted dramatically. The handwriting, once neat and orderly, became erratic and jagged. Words slipped into frantic, spiraled thoughts, detailing not just life in the woods, but a growing obsession with something unseen and perhaps imagined. One entry caught my eye, dated some years back. It read, June 15th, I heard it again last night, the whispering. It's clearer now. They speak in the rustle of the leaves, in the creaking of the branches. They know I can hear them. They're calling me out into the dark. Why won't they reveal themselves? As I delved deeper into the journal, the entries became more disjointed. Paranoia seeped through the pages. The author wrote of shadows moving in the corner of their vision, of voices that murmured through the walls at night, of an oppressive presence that watched from the depths of the forest. August 2nd, it's in the trees. The trees watch and whisper. I tried to run today, to leave this cursed place, but the forest won't let me go. It changes paths, it confuses my steps. I'm trapped here. The whispers say I belong to the woods now. With each entry, the previous inhabitants' descent into madness was palpable. There were sketches interspersed with the text, rough drawings of eyes, trees with twisted faces, and maps of the cabin with lines that looped back on themselves in endless mazes. By the time I reached the final entries, the words were almost incomprehensible, a mixture of frantic scrawls and ominous warnings. The last legible entry was nothing but a repeated phrase, scrawled over and over across the page. They are here. I closed the journal, a cold sweat forming on my brow. The silence of the cabin now felt charged, heavy with the echo of the words I had just read. I listened, half expecting to hear the whispering the journal described, but there was only the sound of my own ragged breathing. Suddenly, the isolation of my situation became overwhelmingly clear. I was alone, deep in the woods, in a cabin that held the last remnants of a tormented mind. The rational part of me knew that the journal was just the product of isolation and perhaps illness. Yet part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something unnatural might indeed be lurking just beyond the threshold of the cabin. With a hurried pace, I returned the journal to its place on the table, my eyes scanning the shadowed corners of the room one last time before I stepped out into the fading light. The forest, once a place of natural beauty and serenity, now seemed a labyrinth of secrets, each tree a silent observer. As I made my way back to the trail, the normal sounds of the forest resumed, a stark contrast to the silence around the cabin. The further I walked, the more the oppressive feeling lifted, replaced by the familiar comfort of bird calls and the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Reaching the safety of my campsite by nightfall, the experience at the cabin seemed surreal, like a vivid dream. Yet the impact of that discovery lingered, a haunting reminder of how solitude can warp the mind, or perhaps unveil hidden truths about the world around us. In the quiet of the night, as I sat by my campfire, I pondered the thin line between reality and madness. The journal remained a mystery, its author lost to time in the woods. Whether driven by madness or haunted by something truly unexplainable, I knew I would never forget the day I stumbled upon the abandoned cabin in the heart of the forest. Story 2. It was a dreary, overcast afternoon when I decided to take the long way home along the old coastal route. The road was notoriously isolated, snaking through dense forests before it traced the jagged coastline. Not many traveled this way anymore, preferring the newer highway that cut the journey time in half. I, however, was drawn by the solitude and the haunting beauty of the sea-sprayed cliffs. As I rounded a sharp bend, the silhouette of a figure emerged from the mist, a hitchhiker, arm outstretched, thumb poised in the age-old gesture of seeking passage. Slowing down, I sized him up through the misted window, a middle-aged man, soaked to the bone, wearing a tattered coat and carrying a backpack that seemed too large for a casual traveler. Against my better judgment, stirred by a pang of sympathy for his drenched state, I pulled over. He hurried to the passenger side, opening the door with a nod of thanks, his face partly obscured by a hood. "Much obliged," he said, his voice hoarse as if unused for some time. I nodded, and as we drove off, the silence hung heavy between us, filled only by the sound of rain pattering against the car. After a few miles, he finally spoke. "You know these parts of stories," he said, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. His tone was not of casual conversation, but seemed almost a warning. I glanced at him curiously, prompting him to continue. "This road, it's old, older than most think," he began, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They say it was built over an ancient path, one used by spirits to reach the sea." His eyes, dark and intense, flicked to mine, gauging my reaction. I chuckled nervously. "Spirits, huh?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, and more than just spirits. Tales of disappearances, strange lights in the woods at night, unexplained shadows that move against the wind." His words carried a weight, an earnestness that chilled the air between us. Curiosity piqued. I urged him to tell me more. He leaned back, his eyes returning to the window. "There was a town not far from here, Whitewood. Ever heard of it?" I shook my head, and he continued. "You wouldn't have. One night, about 100 years ago, it vanished. Every soul, every building, gone without a trace by morning. Some say it was swallowed by the sea, others that it was taken by the fog. But the old folks believe it was something darker, a curse for disturbing sacred ground." The story seemed outlandish, a local legend perhaps, but his delivery made my spine tingle. I asked about more tales, and he obliged. With each mile we covered, his stories grew darker, weaving a tapestry of myth and horror that was hard to dismiss as mere fiction. He talked of ghost ships seen off the coast, their spectral sails illuminated by moonlight, and of hikers who heard whispers in the woods, compelling them to walk off into the darkness, never to return. As the journey continued, a thought nagged at me. There was something unsettling about how he knew so much yet revealed so little about himself. I ventured a question, hoping to uncover more about my mysterious companion. "So, what brings you out here?" "Not many travel this road by choice." He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "I go where the road takes me. Been traveling for a long time." His vague answer did little to satisfy my curiosity, but before I could probe further, he pointed ahead. "Stop the car." Puzzled, I obeyed, pulling over beside an old, rusted sign that marked a trailhead leading into the forest. "Why here?" I asked. He opened the door, the cold air rushing in. "This is my stop." Thank you for the ride. Before I could say another word, he stepped out into the rain and, without looking back, disappeared down the trail, swallowed by the fog and the encroaching darkness of the trees. I sat there for a moment, the engine idling, the sound of his departing footsteps hauntingly absent. His presence had filled the car with an intensity that seemed to linger like a thick smoke. Shaking off the eerie feeling, I continued my drive, but his stories replayed in my mind, each detail sharpening my awareness of the isolated, shadowy road around me. The remainder of the journey felt longer, the landscapes more sinister. Every shadow seemed to shift, every gust of wind sounded like whispers. By the time I reached the familiarity of my hometown, I was relieved but unsettled. His tales, though incredible, felt real somehow, as if he had not just told them, but lived them. That night, I researched the places he mentioned. Whitewood, the ghost ships, the cursed paths, all were well-documented local legends, known to those who cared to dig into the region's dark history. But there was nothing about a traveler, nothing about a man who carried stories like omens. Days turned into weeks, and the hitchhiker's tales became a distant, if unsettling, memory. However, I never traveled that road again, avoiding it as if by instinct. Whether he was merely a storyteller or something more, his presence had left an indelible mark, a whisper of the past that refused to be silent. His final words to me that day, as he vanished into the forest, lingered longest. Remember the stories. They're more real than you think. Whether a warning or a parting gift, they echoed in every shadow and every unexplained noise, a constant reminder of the thin veil between our world and the one that whispers from the depths of forgotten roads. Story 3. As a genealogy enthusiast, my weekend excursions often led me to ancient and forgotten places. This particular Saturday was no exception as I set out to explore an old, overgrown cemetery located on the outskirts of town. My interest was piqued by a local historian who mentioned that the cemetery housed the graves of several founding families of the area, and I hoped to uncover some connections to the town's early days. The cemetery, hidden behind a thick copse of gnarled trees, was surrounded by a rusted iron fence. Its gate creaked ominously as I pushed it open, the sound echoing eerily in the quiet of the late afternoon. Inside, the air was still, and a blanket of fog lay softly over the ground, giving the place an otherworldly feel. I walked among the gravestones, which were mostly obscured by high grass and wild ivy. Many of the markers were weathered and crumbled, their inscriptions faded by time and neglect. It was a place forgotten by most, a relic of a bygone era, and I felt a chill run through me as I contemplated the lives of those buried beneath my feet. As I ventured further into the cemetery, my eyes caught a peculiar sight. There, in a less overgrown part of the graveyard, stood a gravestone that appeared newer than the others. Curious, I approached it, brushing away the ivy that clung to its surface. My heart nearly stopped when I saw the name engraved on the stone. It was my own. Frozen in shock, I stared at the gravestone, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The engraving was clear and unmistakable, displaying not just my name but also my birth date. Beneath that, to my growing horror, was today's date, listed as the day of death. Panic seized me as I stepped back from the stone, my mind racing with impossible questions. How could my name be on this gravestone? Who could have placed it here, and why today's date? The feeling of being watched crept over me, and I spun around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the fog. But there was only silence and the occasional rustle of leaves. Trying to calm my racing heart, I rationalized that it must be some kind of sick joke or a bizarre coincidence. Perhaps someone with the same name had been buried here. Yet the date remained inexplicably tied to the current day, sending shivers down my spine. Determined to get to the bottom of this mystery, I decided to inspect the gravestone further. As I crouched down to examine it, I noticed an envelope lying on the ground, partly hidden by the overgrown grass. It was sealed and had my name written on it in an elegant, flowing script. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in the same ornate handwriting. It read, "Dear seeker of the past, may you have wandered into a realm where time holds a different meaning. This gravestone is a marker not of death, but of life, your life, as it intersects with the echoes of those who came before you. Today marks not the end, but a moment of recognition, a call to remember and honor the forgotten souls of this place. You are connected to this land more deeply than you realize." The letter was unsigned, with no further explanation offered. Confused and more than a little frightened, I reread the letter several times, trying to decipher its meaning. Was I being recruited for some custodial duty of memory, chosen by some unknown force to care for this neglected place? As dusk began to settle over the cemetery, the air grew colder and the fog thickened. I knew I should leave, yet I felt strangely compelled to stay, to learn more about the cemetery and its inhabitants. Driven by this newfound purpose, I spent the next hour clearing away ivy and debris from nearby gravestones, revealing names and dates long forgotten by history. Night had nearly fallen when I finally made my way back to the gate. Looking back one last time at the gravestone with my name, I no longer felt fear. Instead, a sense of responsibility had taken its place, a duty to those who lay resting in that hallowed ground, their memories preserved in stone and now entrusted in some inexplicable way to me. Over the next weeks, I returned many times to the cemetery. I documented each gravestone, researched the names in local archives, and began creating a record of the cemetery's inhabitants. As I pieced together stories from the past, the cemetery began to transform. The town's historical society took an interest, and soon others joined in the effort to restore the site. One day, months later, as I was reviewing the cemetery records, I stumbled upon an old map that showed the original plot of land and its owners, a family with the same last name as mine. It appeared that my ancestors had donated this land for the cemetery in the early 1800s. The realization that I was indeed connected to this place, just as the letter had said, was profound. The gravestone with my name remained an unsolved mystery, but it no longer haunted me. Instead, it stood as a poignant reminder of my link to the past and my duty to the future, a symbol that life and death, memory and oblivion, are deeply intertwined. Each visit to the cemetery strengthened my resolve to ensure that those who were once forgotten were remembered once more. As for the letter, its origins and its author remained unknown, a mystery wrapped in the enigma of the foggy cemetery. But its message was clear and one I took to heart in remembering the past. We honor both the dead and the living, and perhaps in some small way, we keep the echoes of our own souls alive in the annals of time. Story 4. It was a chilly October evening when my friends and I decided to venture into the wilderness for a weekend camping trip. The destination was an isolated spot nestled deep in the woods near the base of Blackwood Mountain, a place reputed for its scenic beauty and tranquil solitude. Among us were Mike, a seasoned camper and the de facto leader of our group, Sarah, who brought along her innate curiosity for nature, Derek, the practical joker of the bunch, and myself, more a lover of indoor comforts but always up for an adventure with friends. As we approached our designated campsite, the sun was already dipping behind the mountain, casting long shadows through the dense canopy of trees. We set up our tents and gathered around the campfire, its crackling flames providing a welcome contrast to the encroaching cold of the evening. Stories and jokes flowed freely, accompanied by the sizzle of cooking sausages and the occasional hoot of a distant owl. At some point during the night, Derek suggested playing a game of hide and seek in the woods. Considering the darkness and our unfamiliarity with the terrain, some of us were hesitant, but Derek's infectious enthusiasm won us over. We set ground rules and boundaries, then drew straws to determine who would be it. Fate chose Derek. With a mischievous grin, he began counting loudly by the fire, his voice echoing into the silent woods as we scattered, giggling and stumbling in the dark. I found a hollow under a fallen tree and crouched down, my heart pounding with the thrill of the game. Minutes passed, and the forest remained eerily silent, save for the distant sound of Derek counting down. Then, silence. We waited for the inevitable rustling and shouts as Derek found each of us, but none came. Instead, an unsettling stillness settled over the woods. After what felt like an eternity, I crawled out from my hiding spot and called out to the others. One by one, Mike and Sarah emerged from their hiding places, expressions of confusion mirroring my own. We regrouped at the campsite but found no sign of Derek. Assuming he was prolonging the game with a prank, we played along, calling out to him with a mix of amusement and slight irritation. "Derek, game's over, man. You got us good, now come out," shouted Mike, trying to penetrate the thick darkness with his flashlight beam. But there was no response, no rustling of leaves, no Derek jumping out to startle us. Concern crept into Sarah's voice as she called out again, her words tinged with worry. Hours passed as we combed the nearby area, our calls becoming more desperate and our initial amusement turning to fear. There was absolutely no trace of Derek. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. As dawn broke, the seriousness of the situation sunk in. We contacted the authorities and a search party was formed. Experienced rescuers and volunteers combed the area, dogs sniffed the forest floor, and drones buzzed overhead. But despite all efforts, no sign of Derek was found, not even a footprint out of place. The days turned into weeks, and the search gradually scaled down. The lack of clues left everyone baffled. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The impact of his disappearance was profound on all of us, leaving a shadow over our group that no passage of time seemed to dispel. Haunted by his loss, I found myself drawn back to the woods months later, needing to understand, or at least to feel closer to whatever had happened. I walked the same paths we had taken, sat by the now cold and unused campsite, and listened to the silence of the forest. It was during one of these visits that I met an old man, a local who claimed to know every inch of these woods. As we talked, he mentioned an old legend I had never heard before, a tale about the Whispering Woods, he called it, where sometimes the forest claimed a soul. He spoke of unexplained phenomena that had occurred in these parts over the centuries, disappearances with no trace, eerie lights seen floating between trees, and disembodied voices whispering on the wind. The story sounded like folklore, crafted to scare curious kids away from straying too deep into the woods. Yet, as he described the tales with a solemn tone, I couldn't help but wonder if Derek's disappearance was part of something beyond our understanding, something ancient and inexplicable. Driven by a newfound need to seek answers, I began researching the history of the area. I pored over old newspaper archives, spoke with locals, and gathered as many accounts of the strange occurrences as I could find. Each story varied in details but was consistent in one eerie fact: people had indeed vanished in these woods, never to be seen again, leaving behind nothing but questions and legends. These explorations did little to provide the closure I sought. If anything, they deepened the mystery and my obsession. Yet they also brought a strange sort of solace, a connection to Derek through the enigmatic lore of the very place that had taken him from us. Now, years later, the memories of that night remain vivid in my mind. Our camping trips have ceased, and our group has drifted apart, each of us wrestling with the loss in our own way. The forest continues to thrive, untouched and unbothered by the human lives it has touched. I no longer search for answers, but I visit the woods from time to time, drawn by a mix of nostalgia and reverence for the mysteries it holds. Each visit is a reminder of the fragility of our existence against the vast, timeless wilderness of the world, a world that holds secrets we may never unravel, and memories of those we have lost, whispering forever among the rustling leaves. Story 5. It was a crisp autumn night, the kind where the air is so clear it magnifies every sound, making the empty streets of my usually quiet town seem eerily silent. I had just returned from a late shift at the office and was looking forward to the comforting solitude of my home. However, as I locked my car and started towards my front door, a strange sound cut through the night air, a child's laughter, light and tinkling, like the sound of a small bell. At first, I thought it might be a television or a radio left on by one of my neighbors, but as I paused to listen, the laughter seemed to move. It was not coming from a house but seemed to be drifting down the street. Curiosity mingled with a growing unease as I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing on the pavement. The laughter led me along the familiar route I took on my evening walks, past rows of tidy houses now dark and silent under the night sky. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the farther I walked, the more I felt the weight of the quiet around me. The laughter echoed again, this time sounding closer, clearer. It was joyful, yet there was something unsettling about it, a surreal quality that did not belong in the dead of night. Turning the corner onto Main Street, I expected to see a group of children playing a late-night game, perhaps enjoying a last bout of freedom before the weekend ended. But the street was deserted. Shops were closed, their windows dark, and the only movement came from a piece of newspaper fluttering across the pavement. The laughter rang out again, this time behind me, and I spun around. There was still no one there. A chill ran down my spine, not just from the night air but from the realization that the laughter had no discernible source. It seemed to be toying with me, a disembodied merriment that bounced from shadow to shadow to shadow. I considered turning back, the comfort of my home calling to me, but my feet moved forward of their own accord, driven by a mix of determination and fear to uncover the source of the sounds. As I continued down Main Street, the laughter grew louder, as though the children were just out of sight, perhaps hiding behind the trees that lined the road or crouching in the doorways of the shops. I called out, "Who's there?" My voice sounded harsh in the quiet, and there was no reply, just the echo of my own words against the brick walls. Then the laughter stopped as abruptly as it had started, replaced by a silence that felt even more oppressive. Heart pounding, I stood still, listening intently. Minutes passed, and just as I was about to give up and head home, the laughter resumed, this time from the direction of the old city park at the end of Main Street. The park was poorly lit, its paths winding and shadowed, leading to an old playground that hadn't seen renovations in decades. It was the last place I wanted to go at night, but the laughter drew me onward. As I approached the playground, the swings moved slightly as if touched by an unseen hand, and the seesaw creaked softly. The laughter was all around now, as if a group of invisible children were playing in the moonlight. Despite the cold, sweat beaded on my forehead, and every instinct screamed at me to leave, to escape the madness of the situation. But then, I heard something else's soft whispering among the laughter, voices so low I had to strain to catch the words. "Come play," they said, a simple invitation repeated over and over. The voice was compelling, almost hypnotic. It filled me with a dread that was palpable, the fear of falling into a trap I could neither see nor comprehend. I took a few hesitant steps towards the playground, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, any hint of the children who belonged to those voices. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, the familiar paths of the park transforming into something unrecognizable. Panic set in as I realized I was lost. The paths twisted, leading me deeper into the darkness. The laughter continued, now mocking, a cacophony of sounds that overwhelmed my senses. It was then that I saw a flicker of movement, a shadow darting between two trees. I followed, my breath coming in short gasps, until I reached the old oak at the center of the park. There, carved into the bark, were names and dates, the remnants of visitors long past. And among them, freshly carved, was my own name with today's date. The realization hit me hard, the final piece of a sinister puzzle snapping into place. The laughter was not an invitation but a warning, a marker of something unexplainable that had claimed this place as its own. Fear, raw and potent, coursed through me, and I ran. I ran until the park was a distant shadow behind me, until the laughter was swallowed by the distance. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath under the safe glow of a streetlight, I looked back. The street was quiet, the night once again still. But the echo of that laughter lingered, a haunting memory that would follow me long after I returned home. In the days that followed, I avoided the park, and the laughter did not return. But the memory of that night remained, a chilling reminder of the unseen worlds that exist just out of sight, where laughter is not a sign of joy but a harbinger of mysteries better left unsolved. Story 6. When I inherited the antique mirror from my late Aunt Matilda, it was under the strangest of circumstances. The will specified that I, and only I, could receive the mirror. It was an exquisite piece, framed in ornate silver with intricate carvings of vines and flowers that seemed almost alive, twisting around the edges. I was thrilled, having always admired it during my childhood visits to her ancient Victorian house, perched at the edge of our sleepy town. The first few days with the mirror in my apartment were uneventful. I hung it in my bedroom, a fitting place for such a beautiful heirloom. By day, it reflected my room with perfect clarity. However, as dusk fell on the third night, something peculiar happened. My reflection seemed to blur, and the room behind me distorted as if looking into another world. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, perhaps tiredness casting shadows where there were none. But then, the whispers started. Soft, barely audible at first, like the wind rustling through leaves. I leaned closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The voices grew clearer, and to my astonishment, figures began to materialize in the mirror. They were shadowy and indistinct, yet unmistakably human in form. The figures whispered of secrets long buried, their voices intertwining into a chorus of murmurs. They spoke of lost loves, hidden treasures, unsolved mysteries, and untimely deaths. Each night brought new stories, each more fascinating and terrifying than the last. I became obsessed, spending every night in front of the mirror, listening intently to the tales from beyond. One evening, a particularly vivid figure appeared. She was an elderly woman, dressed in the fashion of the late 1800s, her eyes filled with a profound sadness. She reached out, her hand pressing against the glass, her voice stronger than the others. "Help me," she pleaded. "Find my Henry. Tell him I wait for him still." Compelled by her sorrow, I embarked on a journey to discover her identity. The local library held decades of archives, and it was there I uncovered the story of Elizabeth Hargrove, a young woman who had disappeared without a trace in 1891. Her fiancé, Henry Worthington, had searched for her tirelessly, his despair documented in numerous newspaper articles, until he too vanished a few years later. Determined to unravel the mystery, I visited the old Hargrove estate, now a dilapidated shadow of its former self. In the cellar, behind a crumbling wall, I discovered a small, locked chest. Inside were letters between Elizabeth and Henry, filled with declarations of love and plans for a future that never came to be. The last letter, unfinished, hinted at a secret meeting the night she disappeared. The next night, as I relayed my findings to Elizabeth's spirit through the mirror, her expression transformed from sorrow to peace. She whispered a heartfelt thanks and slowly faded away, her figure dissolving into the silvery surface until she was gone. The air felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. The whispers didn't cease with Elizabeth's departure. Other spirits came forth, each with their own stories and pleas. The mirror became a gateway to the past, a vessel for the voices of those who had left unfinished business behind. I helped where I could, uncovering truths and delivering messages, becoming a medium between the living and the dead. Months passed, and my life became irrevocably intertwined with the mirror. Friends and family noticed the change in me, the dark circles under my eyes from countless sleepless nights, the way I seemed constantly distracted, lost in thought. They worried, but how could I explain that I was caught in the web of centuries, speaking to ghosts through an antique mirror? Then, one stormy night, the mirror showed me something different. It was not a spirit that gazed back at me, but a dark, formless shadow, its presence malevolent and chilling. The air around me grew cold, the whispers turned to screams, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Fear gripped me, and for the first time I questioned whether meddling with the mirror had invited something sinister into my home. I covered the mirror with a heavy cloth, the silence that followed both a relief and a deafening void. The decision to part with it weighed heavily on my heart, yet I knew it was necessary. With a heavy heart, I donated the mirror to a museum, hoping that in a place guarded by knowledge and history, it would be respected but not feared. Now, my nights are quieter, the whispers gone but not forgotten. Sometimes I wonder about the mirror, about the spirits and their untold stories. The museum reports that it attracts a great deal of attention, though no strange occurrences have been noted since it left my possession. Perhaps it was my connection to Aunt Matilda, or to the town itself, that awakened the mirror's true nature. As I sit in my serene, whisper-free home, I realize that some doors once opened can never be fully closed. The mirror taught me much about the past, about sorrow, and about the unresolved threads that linger like cobwebs in the corners of time. And sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and still, I swear I can hear faint whispers calling me back to a world just beyond the reflection. Story 7. It began on a drizzly Tuesday evening, as I was sorting through some work emails. My phone rang, displaying an unknown number. Normally I would ignore such calls, but a sudden impulse prompted me to answer. Hello, I spoke into the receiver, hearing nothing but a crackling static at first. As I was about to hang up, thinking it was just a poor connection, I caught something else, a faint whisper, like voices murmuring from a great distance. I strained to listen, but the line went dead before I could make out any words. I shook my head, attributing it to a prank or a wrong number, and went back to my emails. The next call came the following night, just as I was about to go to bed. The same unknown number appeared on my phone, and remembering the previous call, a shiver of unease ran through me. I answered hesitantly, greeted again by that eerie static. This time the whispers were clearer, though I still couldn't understand what they were saying. It sounded like multiple voices tangled together, a soft, desperate cacophony that made my heart race. Again, the line abruptly cut off. This pattern continued over the next several days. Each call left me more paranoid and terrified. The whispers grew progressively louder, though no more intelligible. I began to lose sleep, the ringtone that once seemed mundane now a harbinger of fear. After about a week of this, I decided I needed to do something. I couldn't just keep answering these calls without trying to figure out what was happening or who was behind them. The next morning I contacted my phone company. I explained the situation and asked if they could trace the number. The representative was sympathetic but explained that without more to go on, there wasn't much they could do. They offered to block the number, but I refused. I needed answers, and cutting off the only link I had seemed like giving up. Determined to find some resolution, I turned to the internet. I posted on forums, asked if anyone had experienced anything similar, and searched for any clue that might explain what was happening. While I found stories of prank calls and scams, none matched the peculiar nature of these calls, the persistent static, and those unnerving whispers. By the time the phone rang again that night, I was a bundle of anxious energy. This time, however, I had a plan. I had downloaded a sound recording app, hoping to capture the whispers to analyze them later, or to show them to someone who might understand better. I answered the call, and as before, the static and whispers began. I held my breath, recording every second until the call ended. Playing back the recording, I focused on the whispers, trying to isolate them from the static. After several attempts and some amateur adjustments to the audio filters, I managed to clear up part of the recording. The whispers were fragmented in different tones and pitches, like a crowd speaking simultaneously. One phrase, however, seemed to repeat, "Don't find us." Chilled, I sat back, trying to comprehend what I had heard. "Don't find us," what did it mean? Was it a warning, or perhaps a plea? The ambiguity of the message only deepened my fear and confusion. Was I being threatened, or was someone, or something, reaching out for help? The calls continued, each one an echo of the last, always ending before I could establish any real communication. My days became consumed with researching and trying to understand. I spoke to a local historian, wondering if there might be a connection to my house or the land it was on. The historian was intrigued by my story but could offer no concrete answers, only agreeing that the area was old and had a rich history, much of it unrecorded and shrouded in local lore. As my investigation stalled, my nerves frayed. I was jumping at every sound, seeing shadows where there were none. My friends and family noticed the change in me, and I confided in a few close friends about the calls. While they were concerned, there was little they could do to help. Some suggested it might be a hoax, someone manipulating phone technology to terrorize me for reasons unknown. Others thought perhaps I was overreacting, the stress of work and these strange calls creating phantoms. One night, several weeks after the first call, I received another call. This time, when I answered, there was a moment of silence before the static and whispers began. In that brief pause, I spoke, my voice firm. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" To my astonishment, the whispers halted momentarily. Then, a single, clear voice came through, a plaintive whisper that felt laden with sorrow. "Remember us." The line went dead. Those two words haunted me more than any of the calls. "Remember us," it felt like a key, a piece of a puzzle I was still assembling in my mind. I dove back into historical records, this time focusing on any local events that had been forgotten or overlooked. My search led me to old newspaper archives, where I discovered a report of a tragic accident that had occurred decades ago, not far from where I lived. A building had collapsed and several people had died, their names barely mentioned in the brief article. Armed with this information, I visited the local library, seeking more details. I learned that the building had once stood on what was now an empty lot, just at the end of my street. No memorial had ever been erected, the tragedy had faded from public memory. Feeling a deep, unexplainable connection to these forgotten souls, I decided to create a small memorial myself. I gathered stones, flowers, and a plaque with the names I had found, placing them respectfully in the empty lot. The calls stopped after that. Whether it was coincidence or something more, I couldn't say. But every night, when I passed by the memorial on my evening walk, I whisper a quiet thanks to the voices that had reached out to me, hoping I've done enough to honor their memory. Story 8. When my grandmother passed away, she left me her old house, a towering Victorian relic that had been in our family for generations. It was in this house that I decided to spend my summer, sorting through decades of accumulated memories and relics. Among the dusty boxes and ancient furniture stored in the attic, I found a peculiar doll. This doll was unlike the others nestled in the attic's shadows. It It was about 2 feet tall, with porcelain skin and glassy blue eyes that shimmered with an eerie realism. Its hair was curled into tight, golden ringlets, and it wore a faded blue dress with lace trimmings. But it wasn't the doll's antique clothing or delicate craftsmanship that caught my attention, it was the way its eyes seemed to follow me. No matter where I moved, those piercing blue eyes watched, lending a lifelike quality that sent shivers down my spine. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or my imagination fueled by the creepy ambience of the old attic. Deciding it was a valuable antique, I took it downstairs to my bedroom, placing it on a small chair in the corner. That evening, I researched the doll and discovered it was from the late 1800s, a collector's item indeed. Satisfied with my find, I eventually drifted off to sleep. However, the peace of the night was short-lived. I awoke suddenly, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. The room was bathed in moonlight, casting long shadows across the floor. My heart froze when I saw the doll was no longer in the chair. Instead, it stood at the foot of my bed, its expression twisted into a sinister grin that hadn't been there before. Panic gripped me, and for a moment I was too afraid to move. Eventually, mustering every ounce of courage, I jumped up and turned on the light. The harsh brightness seemed to wash away the menacing aura, and the doll's face appeared as it had before, expressionless. Convinced my sleepy mind had played tricks on me, I placed the doll back in the chair, trying to laugh off my fright. The next morning, with the sun high and bright, the doll's eerie demeanor from the night before seemed absurd. As I prepared breakfast, I reasoned it was just the product of an overactive imagination in the strange new environment. But the day brought no comfort from the unsettling feelings, and as dusk approached, a sense of foreboding settled over me. Determined to prove to myself that it was all in my head, I set up my smartphone to record the area where I'd placed the doll, hoping to capture proof that it was just my imagination. That night I went to sleep with the light on, uneasy but hopeful. Morning light revealed nothing unusual, but when I checked the footage from my phone, my blood ran cold. The video showed the doll slowly turning its head to stare directly at the camera, its mouth curling into a ghastly smile before it stood up and walked out of frame. The timestamp showed this happened just past midnight. I was terrified, unable to comprehend how an inanimate object could move. The logical part of my brain urged me to dispose of the doll, to remove it from my home, but another part, perhaps curiosity or disbelief, needed to understand more. I decided to visit the local library to dig into the history of the house, and hopefully the doll. At the library, I found old newspapers and records that mentioned my great-great-great-grandfather, who had been a well-known judge in the late 1800s. He was reputed to be a stern, unforgiving man. Among the articles, I stumbled upon a tragic story about a young girl, the daughter of a man my ancestor had sentenced to death. The article mentioned how she had cursed my family before she mysteriously disappeared. A chill ran down my spine as I connected the dots. The doll closely resembled the description of the girl. I raced home, determined to rid myself of the doll. But upon arriving, I found the doll sitting on the kitchen table, holding what appeared to be an old piece of parchment. Hesitantly, I took it from its hands. It was a letter written in faded ink, addressed to my great-great-grandfather, begging for the life of the girl's father. The letter was never sent. Realizing what I had to do, I took the doll and the letter to the old family cemetery on the edge of the property. There, beneath the boughs of ancient oaks, I buried the doll with the letter, hoping to grant peace to the spirit that seemed so desperately bound to it. That night, the atmosphere in the house changed. The oppressive, watchful sensation lifted, and for the first time since I had arrived, I felt a sense of peace. I believe I set her spirit free, the spirit of the girl who had lost so much and had been trapped in silent vigil, watching through glass eyes, waiting for justice or perhaps just acknowledgement. Though the doll no longer resides in my house, the story of its origin and the truths hidden within my family's history linger with me. I learned that sometimes the ghosts of the past are not specters in the night, but memories and regrets that we must face and honor. And sometimes, just sometimes, they need us to listen. Story 9. It started as a simple curiosity. I had recently moved into an old Victorian house that was beautiful, albeit slightly decrepit, with intriguing architectural quirks and a dusty, mysterious ambience that seemed perfect for my photography hobby. Among the many rooms, one in particular, an old study with bay windows and heavy velvet curtains, captivated my imagination. I began my project to document the house, taking photos room by room, planning to eventually compile a photo essay. The camera I used was an old, reliable DSLR, not prone to malfunctions, which is why what happened next was particularly baffling. Each time I attempted to photograph the study, the pictures came out blurred and distorted, as if the lens was smeared with grease. I cleaned the lens meticulously after the first few attempts, but the results were the same: no clarity, just shapes melting into a surreal, dreamlike haze. It was frustrating, yet oddly compelling. I became obsessed with capturing a clear image of that room. One evening, determined to get a decent shot, I adjusted the settings on my camera, thinking perhaps the lighting was to blame, or maybe the reflective surfaces within the room were somehow interfering with the focus. As I peered through the viewfinder, adjusting my stance, I noticed something unsettling: a faint silhouette of a figure standing by the bookshelf, barely discernible among the shadows. I blinked, and it was gone. Chalking it up to fatigue, I shook my head and took a series of photos, each one as blurred as the last. However, when I reviewed the images on the larger screen of my computer, the vague outline of shadowy figures appeared in the background of each photo, becoming increasingly defined with every shot. They were there, and then they weren't as soon as I would look up. The room appeared normal, the photographs revealing what my eyes seemingly could not see. This phenomenon piqued my curiosity rather than scaring me. I wondered if it might be a trick of the light, or perhaps something more spectral after all. The house was old and filled with history. It could be a goldmine for a photographer like me, if I could just figure out how to capture these apparitions clearly. I decided to set up a video camera in the room to record continuously, hoping to catch these figures in real time. The first few hours of footage revealed nothing unusual, but as I was reviewing the video late one night, I noticed a flicker of movement at the edge of the frame. As I watched, entranced, shadowy figures began to slowly materialize around the room. They moved with a glacial pace, barely perceptible, like a whisper of smoke caught in a breeze. The figures seemed to be interacting with each other, oblivious to the modern world layered upon their timeless haunt. The more I observed, the more their forms became clear. They were dressed in what looked like Victorian garb: long dresses, formal suits, and they behaved as if engaged in a silent, genteel gathering. It struck me then that perhaps these were not malevolent spirits, but echoes of the past, imprints left in a space they once considered their own. Excited by this discovery, I invited a local paranormal expert, Dr. Emily Harrows, to view the footage. Her interest was immediate and intense. After several nights of observing and recording, Dr. Harrows theorized that the room might be a hotspot for residual hauntings, a place where emotions and events of the past are replayed like a loop on old film. It's not that these are ghosts, aware of us and trying to communicate, she explained. They are more like memories imprinted on the fabric of the house because of their emotional significance. Armed with this new understanding, I continued to document the phenomena using different cameras and techniques. Dr. Harrows brought in specialized equipment designed to measure electromagnetic fields and environmental variables that might elucidate the conditions under which the apparitions appeared. One night, while adjusting one of the cameras, I inadvertently captured a clear, focused image of the room without any blurriness. There were no figures in this shot, just the old furniture and the dusty rays of moonlight filtering through the curtains. It was a beautiful, serene image, starkly different from the eerie, animated gatherings I had been filming. I realized then that perhaps the key to these hauntings was not just the place, but also the time and the observer. Maybe the act of observing, of trying to capture these echoes, somehow brought them to life, or perhaps they existed continuously, unseen by those not looking for them. The project culminated in a gallery exhibit entitled Echoes of the Past. It featured both the blurred, ghostly images and the clear photographs I had taken of the study. Visitors were captivated by the contrast and the story behind the images. The exhibit posed questions about the nature of reality and perception, about what exists just beyond the edge of our senses. As for the study, it remained my favorite room in the house. Sometimes late at night I would sit there in the dim light, feeling the weight of history around me, listening for the faint laughter and whispers of the past. Whether it was merely the power of suggestion or something truly supernatural, I came to appreciate the mystery and the beauty of it. The house, with all its quirks and shadows, had become more than just a subject for my photography. It had become a window into a world that I had never imagined I would explore. And those disappearing photographs, they were my invitation to look deeper, to see beyond the veil of the visible, and to capture the fleeting moments of a past that refused to be forgotten. Story 10. It was a rainy Saturday when I stumbled upon the peculiar painting in a cluttered corner of an old thrift store. Nestled among forgotten treasures and trinkets from bygone days, the painting drew me in. It depicted a seemingly tranquil village scene, but there was an underlying tension that piqued my curiosity. I noticed that the faces of the villagers were slightly blurred, their expressions indistinct. At a glance they appeared normal, but a lingering look revealed subtle distortions, as if they were contorting in slow, agonizing pain. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, I was compelled to buy the painting. Its mystery was intoxicating. The store owner, an elderly woman with keen, sharp eyes, seemed reluctant to part with it. She warned me, her voice low and serious. It's an odd one, that. Changes with the light, or so they say. Her cryptic words only fueled my fascination, and I left the store with the painting under my arm, eager to explore its secrets. At home, I hung the painting in my living room, where the light from the large bay window could play upon its surface. Initially, the villagers seemed merely to be going about their daily tasks: women at the well, men in the fields, children playing near the woods. But as the day waned and the shadows grew, their faces began to twist into expressions of sheer terror and agony. The more I stared, the more the painting seemed to come alive, the figures almost writhing under some unseen torment. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling of being watched. The sensation was so strong that I found myself waking up multiple times, half expecting to find someone or something at the foot of my bed. By morning, frazzled and sleep-deprived, I was convinced the painting had to go. But when I went to remove it, the scene had changed once again. Now the village was peaceful, bathed in the soft glow of a morning sun, the faces serene. It was as if the night's horrors had never happened. Curiosity overcame my unease, and I decided to delve into the history of the painting. I returned to the thrift store, hoping the owner might shed some light. The woman listened intently, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully as I recounted my experience. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice a whisper. It's said to be from a small village in Eastern Europe, ravaged by war long ago. The artist was the sole survivor, a man who lost his family and friends. They say he poured his grief into his paintings, and his loss making the scenes come alive. Some believe the souls of the village are trapped within the canvas, reliving their final moments over and over. Her story chilled me to the bone, but it also made me look at the painting with new eyes. I felt a responsibility now, not just fear. If there were souls trapped within the canvas, perhaps there was something I could do to help them. I spent the following weeks researching the village and the war that had decimated it. I learned of ancient rituals believed to release spirits bound to objects. Though skeptical, I felt compelled to try anything that might bring peace to the restless entities within the painting. One quiet evening, equipped with candles and incense, I performed the ritual. As I recited the old words, the air around me grew inexplicably cold, and the painting seemed to flicker, the images shifting rapidly. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped, and the room returned to normal. From that night on, the painting stabilized. The village remained serene, its inhabitants going about their lives with no hint of the previous agony. I'd like to believe I helped them somehow, that they were no longer prisoners of their tragic past. Yet the mystery of the painting didn't end there. Word of my experience spread, catching the interest of a local historian who specialized in art from war-torn regions. He examined the painting and confirmed its origin from the described village. His theory was that the artist had used a technique involving thermochromic materials which changed with temperature and light, explaining the initial shifts. But as for the dramatic transformations I witnessed, he could offer no scientific explanation. The painting now hangs in a local museum, part of an exhibit on art influenced by conflict. It continues to draw attention, its backstory as captivating as its mysterious behavior. Occasionally I visit, standing before it in the quiet of the museum, watching the peaceful village scene. Sometimes I swear I see a subtle shift in the expressions of the villagers, a slight smile, or a hint of sadness in their eyes. It's a reminder that while the painting may no longer shift dramatically, it still holds a deep, ineffable connection to its origins. As for me, the experience has left me with a profound respect for the power of art to hold and convey deep human emotions, and perhaps to hold something even more profound. The painting taught me that some mysteries are not meant to be solved completely, and some doors, once opened, reveal paths we never expected to walk. Story 11. When I first walked through the house that would become my home, it was love at first sight. The charming two-story Victorian, nestled in a quaint neighborhood, seemed like the perfect place to start anew after a tumultuous year. Little did I know that the house had more character than I bargained for. The initial days of moving in were filled with the typical chaos: boxes stacked in corners, furniture halfway assembled, and a constant stream of deliveries. The excitement of setting up a new home kept my spirits high, despite the exhaustion. It wasn't until the third night, when the dust had settled and the silence of the house began to deepen, that I noticed something unusual. It started as a whisper, so faint I thought it might have been the wind curling around the eaves. But as I lay in bed, the sound grew clearer, distinctly like voices. They were low and indistinct, murmuring from within the walls themselves. At first I reasoned it was the house settling, or perhaps the echo of pipes. An old house like this was bound to make some odd noises. But night after night, the whispers grew louder and more fervent. I could hear them in the living room, in the bathroom, but they were the loudest and most persistent in my bedroom. The timbre of the whispers was unsettlingly human, as if a group of unseen people were holding a conversation just beyond the sheetrock. Sleep became elusive. Each night I lay in bed with a growing sense of dread, straining to understand the words. The more I listened, the more the whispers seemed to press against the confines of the walls, eager to be heard. The bits and pieces I caught were disjointed, often nonsensical snatches of phrases, laughter, sometimes even a shout. Driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, I decided to investigate. I started by asking neighbors about the history of the house, but no one could provide any details that explained the voices. The previous owners, a kindly old couple, had mentioned nothing out of the ordinary, and their disclosure documents were conspicuously silent on the subject of nocturnal whispers. My next step was more drastic. I hired a contractor to inspect the walls, half expecting or perhaps hoping they would find some logical anomaly, anything from animals nesting in the walls to faulty wiring. But the inspection came up empty. The walls were solid and well insulated, with no signs of infestation or structural issues. The contractor, a grizzled man with decades of experience, did offer one piece of advice before he left. "Houses like these," he said, glancing around the old Victorian with a mixture of respect and wariness, "they've got histories. Sometimes they keep a bit of every soul that's lived here." His words stuck with me as I lay awake that night, listening to the whispers. It was then that I realized I needed to understand what was happening, not just for the sake of my sanity, but perhaps for the sake of whatever was trapped within the walls. I started spending my evenings in the local library, poring over old newspapers, land records, and any documents that mentioned the house. I learned that my new home had been built in the late 1800s by a prosperous merchant who later met a tragic end in a mysterious fire that consumed his business. The house had changed hands many times since, with several owners reporting strange occurrences, none, however, as specific as the voices I was hearing. Armed with this knowledge, I contacted a paranormal research team. Skeptical but desperate, I watched as they set up their equipment, sensors that could detect sound frequencies beyond human hearing, and cameras sensitive to various forms of light. The first few hours of their investigation were uneventful. But as midnight approached, the time when the whispers usually intensified, the sensors began to pick up anomalies. The researchers, huddled around their monitors, listened intently as the murmurs I had become so familiar with filled the room, now loud enough for everyone to hear. The lead researcher, a woman named Dr. Allison Hart, explained that what we were hearing might be a form of residual haunting. "It's like a tape loop," she said, "an imprint of a past event that's strong enough to leave a mark on the environment. These voices aren't conscious or aware, they're just echoes." The investigation continued into the early hours of the morning. At one point, Dr. Hart asked me to speak directly to the voices, a request that felt both absurd and terrifying. I hesitated, my voice shaking as I addressed the empty air. "Who are you? What do you want?" To my astonishment, the whispers paused, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then, a single, clear word echoed through the speakers set up by the researchers' home. It was a revelation, a breakthrough that felt both profound and heartbreaking. These voices, these remnants of lives once lived, were bound to the house just as surely as I was. Perhaps they recognized in me a kindred spirit, or perhaps they simply yearned for acknowledgement, a confirmation that they had once existed. Following Dr. Hart's advice, I began a new routine. Every night before I went to bed, I would walk through the house, acknowledging the whispers, speaking to them gently. "You are remembered," I would say, a simple mantra of recognition and respect. Slowly, the whispers began to quiet. They never fully disappeared, but their presence became softer, like a benediction rather than a haunting. I could sleep again, comforted by the thought that these echoes of the past were at peace, soothed by being remembered. And so, the house with its murmuring walls became my home, a place filled with memories, both mine and those of others who had come before. It was a living tapestry, woven from the threads of countless lives, a reminder that we all leave echoes in the places we hold dear. Story 12. It all began when I moved into the old row house on the edge of the historic district. The place had been a steal, likely due to its reputation for being haunted, a fact that I'd initially scoffed at, attributing such tales to community folklore. Yet, As I began settling in, strange occurrences made me question my skepticism, particularly involving an antique mirror in the upstairs bathroom. The mirror was large and ornate, framed in tarnished silver with intricate floral patterns etched into the metal. It gave off an air of antiquity and a bit of solemnity, a relic from another era that had somehow found its place in the modern world. From the first time I gazed into it, I felt an uneasy sensation, as if I were intruding into a space where I didn't belong. One evening, while brushing my teeth, I saw a dark figure standing behind me in the reflection. It was so vivid yet indistinct, a shadow with no discernible features, just the shape of a person. I spun around, heart racing, only to find nothing there. When I looked back into the mirror, the figure was still present, unmoving and silent. This phenomenon became a nightly occurrence. Every time I looked into the mirror, the shadow was there. It never moved, never spoke, and while it didn't seem to mean harm, its presence filled me with an inexplicable dread. I began avoiding the mirror, using only the small, handheld one I bought, but curiosity and a desire to understand kept gnawing at me. Determined to uncover the truth, I started researching the house's history. I visited the local library, poring over property records, old newspapers, and any mention of my new home. I discovered that the house was over a century old and had been built by a prominent local doctor who mysteriously disappeared after the tragic death of his wife. The story piqued my interest. Could this shadow be related to the doctor or his wife? My quest for answers led me to a seance hosted by a medium known for her expertise in paranormal phenomena. As skeptical as I was, desperation drove me to explore even the most unconventional avenues. During the seance, the medium went into a trance and spoke of a deep, unresolved sorrow tied to my house, a spirit anchored to an object within. She described the mirror exactly. Armed with this new information, I decided it was time to face the shadow directly. That night I stood before the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest, and addressed the figure directly. "Who are you? What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. There was no response, but as I continued to stare, the air in the room grew colder, and the figure seemed to become more distinct, its edges sharper. I felt a wave of sadness wash over me, so intense it was almost suffocating. It was a feeling of loss, of profound grief that wasn't my own. The emotions were so overpowering, I had to step away, but I knew then that whatever haunted the mirror was suffering. The next day, I invited the medium to my home. Together, we performed a cleansing ritual. She instructed me to place candles around the mirror and burn sage, while she chanted in a language I didn't understand. The air shimmered around the mirror, and for a moment, the shadow appeared to waver, as if caught in a breeze. Then, as quickly as it had come, the figure vanished. The medium explained that the spirit had been the doctor's wife. She had died in that very room, her life cut tragically short, and her spirit had clung to the mirror, a piece she had cherished in life. The ritual, it seemed, had given her the peace needed to move on. After the shadow disappeared, the house felt lighter, as if a heavy blanket had been lifted. I could look in the mirror again without fear, and the bathroom no longer felt like a place to avoid. Yet, the experience left a lasting impression on me. I could no longer dismiss the supernatural so easily, nor could I ignore the history embedded in old walls and old objects. I began to treat the house with a new reverence, restoring it with care rather than altering it to fit modern tastes. I preserved what I could of its original fixtures and decor, honoring the lives of those who had lived there before me. The mirror, though now just a mirror, remained in the bathroom. Sometimes I would stop and stare into it, half expecting to see something, but all I saw was my own reflection staring back. It served as a reminder of the house's history and of the woman who had once called it home. In sharing the story, I found that others were drawn to the house, curious about its past and its paranormal legacy. The shadow in the mirror became a local legend, a tale told and retold, each time with new embellishments. For me, though, it was more than just a story. It was a profound encounter with the unknown, a reminder that sometimes the things we can't explain are the most real of all. Story 16. Every night, the dream began the same way. I found myself standing at the edge of a dark, dense forest under the shadow of a crescent moon. The air was thick with mist, and the trees loomed like sentinels, their branches reaching out like the fingers of giants. A chilling wind whispered through the leaves, beckoning me forward into the blackness. And every night, I obliged, stepping into the forest with a sense of impending doom that I couldn't explain. As soon as I entered the woods, the chase would begin. I never saw what pursued me, but I felt its presence, an oppressive, malevolent force that seemed as old as the forest itself. Branches cracked underfoot as I ran, the ground slippery with fallen leaves and mud. The canopy above was so thick that not even moonlight penetrated it, casting my path into complete darkness. The unseen entity was always just a step behind, its heavy footsteps syncing with my racing heart. Panic gripped me as I dodged trees and leapt over roots, my breath ragged and loud in the silent night. The dream felt vividly real, the fear palpable, and each night, as I neared exhaustion, I would stumble and fall to the ground. That's when I would wake up, gasping for air in my own bed, the echoes of footsteps still resonating in my ears as they trailed off into the night. The dream was so recurrent that it began to haunt my waking hours. I found myself jumping at small noises, looking over my shoulder as if the entity from my dreams might materialize in the real world. Determined to understand the meaning behind these nightmares, I sought the advice of a therapist, Dr. Helen Foster, who specialized in dream analysis. In our sessions, she suggested that the dream could be manifesting from stress or unresolved issues in my life. Together, we explored various aspects of my past and present, searching for connections or triggers, but nothing seemed to resonate. Dr. Foster then proposed a different approach: lucid dreaming. If I could become aware that I was dreaming while the chase was happening, perhaps I could confront the presence or alter the dream's outcome. Intrigued and desperate for a resolution, I agreed to try. Over the next few weeks, I practiced the techniques Dr. Foster taught me: reality checks throughout the day, keeping a dream journal, and visualizing becoming lucid before sleep. Gradually, I started to gain awareness in my dreams, but gaining control was another matter. Each time I realized I was dreaming, the dark forest and the fear of being chased felt all too real, and I would slip back into the script of the nightmare. Then, one night, it happened. I was running through the forest, the presence hot on my heels, when suddenly clarity struck. I was dreaming. This time, instead of succumbing to panic, I stopped running and turned around. There was nothing but the dark, dense forest and the sound of my own heavy breathing. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" I shouted into the darkness. There was a moment of silence, and then from the shadows a figure emerged. It was cloaked in darkness, its features obscured, but it had a human form. The figure stopped just short of the moonlight that dared to penetrate the forest canopy. "You are running from your fears," it said, its voice echoing like a whisper carried by the wind. "You carry them with you like chains." "What fears?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Your fear of failure, of not being good enough, of the future," the figure replied. "You must confront them if you are ever to be free." Armed with this revelation, I faced the figure, no longer running. "I am not afraid," I declared, though my voice still wavered. As I spoke the words, The figure began to dissolve into the mist, and the forest around me lightened. I woke up that morning feeling different. The nightmare didn't return the following nights. Instead, I slept peacefully, and when I discussed the dream with Dr. Foster, she nodded thoughtfully. "You've confronted your shadow," she explained. "It's a Jungian concept, the dark side of your psyche that you suppress. Facing it can be transformative." Emboldened by the resolution of my dreams, I began to tackle my real-life fears. I took on challenges at work with a new vigor and started projects I had been putting off, fearing I wasn't skilled enough. Each step forward boosted my confidence, reaffirming the confrontation with my shadow in the dream. Months later, the dream returned one final time. I found myself again at the edge of the forest, but this time I walked in confidently. The entity appeared not as a pursuer, but as a guide, leading me to a clearing where the moonlight shone brightly. There was no chase, no fear, just a profound sense of peace. The recurring nightmare that once tormented my nights had become a symbol of personal growth and understanding. I had learned that the dark forest and the ominous presence were parts of me, manifestations of my own fears and anxieties. By confronting them, I not only ended the nightmares but also found a deeper strength within myself, a strength that carried over into my waking life. The echo of footsteps that once filled me with dread now reminded me of the journey I had taken, a journey not away from my fears, but directly into their midst, where I found not terror, but truth. Story 17. The day started innocently enough, with a sense of adventure pulsing through me as I decided to explore the dense woods that bordered the small rural town where I had recently moved. The forest was notorious in local lore. Whispers of strange happenings and unexplained disappearances were common in the town's diner and at the local bar. I was a freelance writer, always on the lookout for a story, and the tales of the haunted woods intrigued me more than they deterred. Armed with my camera, notebook, and a strong flashlight, I entered the woods in the late morning. The forest was thick with ancient trees, their branches intertwining above to create a canopy that barely let any sunlight through. It was cooler here, the air tinged with the musty scent of damp leaves and moss. I wandered for hours, taking notes and photos, immersed in the eerie beauty of the place. It was during my deeper foray into the woods that I stumbled upon the cabin. It was almost entirely obscured by overgrowth, its wooden walls aged and gray, with some sort of symbols carved into the wood that looked disturbingly like sigils or runes used in occult practices. The door of the cabin was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze, a silent invitation, or perhaps a silent challenge. Pushing aside my rising apprehension, I stepped inside. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of old earth and something faintly metallic that I couldn't immediately place. My flashlight beam darted around the room, revealing a small, one-room cabin that looked as though it had been abandoned in haste. A layer of dust covered everything, but what caught my attention was the circle of scorched earth in the center of the room. Surrounding the charred patch of floor were more symbols, these painted in what looked ominously like dried blood. Scattered around were remnants of candles, small bones that looked disturbingly human, and tattered pages filled with more cryptic writing. The scene clearly spoke of occult rituals, perhaps long forgotten or recently abandoned. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I took photos and notes, documenting every detail with a professional detachment that I didn't truly feel. The sense of overwhelming dread grew with each moment I spent inside the cabin, every shadow seeming to flicker unnaturally in the periphery of my vision. As I turned to leave, thinking I had enough material for a compelling story, I noticed a small, leather-bound book partly hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Pulling it free, I opened it to find it filled with handwritten notes. It was a journal detailing the activities of someone deeply engrossed in the dark arts, speaking of summoning something they called the Whispering Shade. The entries became increasingly erratic, the handwriting more frantic as I turned the pages. The last entry was the most disturbing, filled with apologies and warnings about a ritual gone wrong, and a plea for anyone reading to leave before they, too, were consumed by whatever had been summoned. I pocketed the journal, heart pounding with a mix of fear and the adrenaline of discovering such a story. As I stepped outside, the light had begun to fade, the sun was setting, and the woods were getting darker. I hurried back toward the path I had come from, the sense of dread escalating with every noise that broke the near silence of the fading day. The forest seemed denser, the path less clear as shadows lengthened and merged. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot made me jump, my mind recalling the journal's final words, warning of the whispering shade. I felt watched, pursued even, by something I couldn't see but could feel a presence, oppressive and dark, clinging to my back like a shroud. By the time I emerged from the woods, night had fully fallen, and never had the lights of my small, rented cottage felt so welcoming. Once inside, I locked the door and sat down to transcribe my notes and study the photos I had taken. But every time I tried to focus, the sense of dread overwhelmed me, forcing me to look over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing in the shadows. Sleep was elusive that night and many nights after. I published my story, excluding the most unsettling parts for fear of not being believed. It was well received, feeding the local lore, adding another layer to the legends of the haunted forest. However, the personal toll was steep. I could not shake the feeling of being watched, of a presence lingering just at the edge of my senses. The journal I found remained hidden away, a reminder of the day I walked into a story that perhaps I should have left alone. The woods bordering the town stood unchanged, a silent sentinel hiding its secrets, and I never entered them again, content to observe from a distance and respect the old adage, some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 18. I had always found a certain solace in my routine, a comfort in the predictability of my days. That sense of security shattered the morning my reflection in the bathroom mirror didn't mimic my actions. Instead, it smirked back at me with a chilling grin that slowly stretched across its face, unbidden and unfamiliar. My heart raced, my body froze, and a cold sweat broke out across my brow as I stared, unbelieving, into the mirror. My reflection, it wasn't me. Not really. It mimicked my likeness, but with a malevolent twist. Initially, I thought it was a trick of the light or perhaps a momentary lapse in my sanity. I splashed water on my face, blinked hard, and looked again. There it was, mimicking my movements, but always a fraction of a second delayed, with that eerie, knowing smile. It was as if it was conscious, aware, and taunting me. Terrified, I left for work, but the image haunted me throughout the day. When I returned home, I approached the bathroom cautiously, peering around the corner with trepidation. My reflection awaited, its grin wider, more sinister. This time when I moved, it just stared, its smile a silent challenge. Sleep eluded me that night, and the following morning I covered the mirror with a towel. But every reflective surface became a potential enemy. The television screen, the windows at night, even the shiny surface of my toaster each held a glimpse of that grin. I started covering everything reflective in my home. Drapes remained drawn, appliances were draped with cloths, and mirrors were hidden behind sheets. Despite these precautions, I felt its eyes on me, always watching, always grinning. That sense of being observed never left, clawing at the edges of my sanity. Desperate for help but too afraid of sounding mad, I sought the advice of a psychiatrist, Dr. Ellis, under the guise of stress and lack of sleep. Dr. Ellis was patient and understanding, suggesting that stress or a latent trauma could be manifesting in hallucinations. She recommended medication to help with the anxiety and the hallucinations, but also encouraged me to confront whatever it was I was seeing, to assert control over it. Her advice sounded reasonable, yet the thought of facing that sinister reflection filled me with dread. However, as the days passed and the feeling of being watched grew more oppressive, I knew I had to do something. One evening, fueled by a mix of desperation and the calming effect of the medication, I uncovered the bathroom mirror. I stared into it, steeling myself against the rush of fear. My reflection initially mimicked me, but then that smile crept in, twisting its features into a ghoulish caricature. "Stop it," I shouted at the mirror. "Leave me alone," but the reflection only grinned wider, and then, to my horror, it spoke. "You cannot get rid of me," it whispered with a voice like the hiss of thin ice. "I am you." Its words struck me like ice water, and in a fit of terror I smashed the mirror with my fist. The glass shattered, scattering across the floor with a violence that mirrored the turmoil inside me. Bleeding and breathless, I fled the room. The next morning I found that the destruction of one mirror had not solved my problem. Every piece of broken glass still reflected that grin, each shard an eye into that sinister other world. I cleaned up the mess, cutting my hands in the process, and disposed of every piece, but the damage was done. The house felt more oppressive than ever, as if I had angered it by my defiance. In a last-ditch effort, I reached out to a local priest, Father O'Hara, known in my community for dealing with spiritual and paranormal issues. He listened to my story with a grave face and agreed to visit my house. Father O'Hara walked through each room, his presence seeming to lighten the air. He spoke prayers and sprinkled holy water, especially in areas I had found most oppressive. When he reached the bathroom, he paused, his brow furrowed in concentration. "For evil sometimes latches onto us when we are most vulnerable," he explained. "It can manifest in ways that are specific to our fears, feeding on them." He placed a small, blessed crucifix where the mirror had hung. "This will help, but you must also help yourself," he advised. "Face what haunts you with strength, and do not let it feed on your fear." After he left, the house did feel lighter, less oppressive, but the true test came at night. I lay in my bed, waiting, watching, my heart pounding in the dark. Hours passed and nothing happened. No smirk, no watching eyes. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. In the days that followed, my confidence slowly returned. I uncovered the windows, put away the cloths, and even bought a new mirror. When I hung it up, I looked into it with a mix of fear and defiance. But there was only me, just me. My normal reflection, with no sinister grin or malicious intent. Perhaps Father O'Hara had driven it away, or perhaps I had conquered my fear enough to dispel whatever power it held over me. Whichever it was, I finally felt free. I continue to see Dr. Ellis, working through the fears that had perhaps invited this ordeal. I've learned the importance of facing my anxieties, of asserting control over what I allow to dominate my thoughts. And every morning when I look in the mirror, I remind myself of the strength it took to overcome the darkness, knowing that whatever looks back at me now is nothing but my own reflection. Story 19. It started as an ordinary Thursday evening. I had just returned from a long day at work, looking forward to a quiet night at home. But as I stepped through the front door, a sense of unease washed over me. The hallway seemed longer, the shadows deeper, and there was a palpable tension in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. At first, I dismissed the feeling as residual stress from my job. I tried to shake it off, hanging my coat and heading into the living room. That's when I noticed the first of many abnormalities. My comfortable, familiar couch had transformed into a misshapen, lumpy form, its fabric pulsating as if breathing. The walls appeared to subtly warp and flex, and the family photos hanging on them were distorted, the faces twisted into grotesque grimaces. Frightened but fascinated, I touched one of the pictures, half expecting my hand to sink into something soft and malleable. Instead, the surface was as hard as ever, but the image recoiled at my touch, the smiles contorting even further in silent screams. Pulling my hand back, I felt a chill run down my spine. I decided to explore more of the house, hoping to find some clue as to what was happening. As I moved through the kitchen, the reality around me became increasingly fluid. The refrigerator groaned under a dented facade, its usual humming now a low moan. The tiles on the floor undulated under my feet, making me feel seasick. Every utensil and appliance seemed imbued with a sinister life of its own. By the time I reached the staircase, my heart was pounding fiercely. Each step creaked ominously, bending unnaturally under my weight, as if they might give way at any moment. The banister twisted like the branches of an old tree in a storm, groaning as if in pain. Upstairs was no better. The hallway stretched impossibly long before me, the doors to the various rooms pulsating as if breathing. My bedroom door, usually inviting, now loomed like the gate to a nightmare. I pushed it open with a trembling hand. Inside the room was a carnival of horrors. The curtains blew inward even though the window was closed, fluttering as though caught in a perpetual gust of wind. My bed had grown oversized, the sheets writhing as if covered in crawling insects. The closet door swung open slowly, creaking with a sound like a moan, revealing clothes that twisted and writhed as if trying to escape their hangers. Terrified, I ran from the room, only to find that the layout of the house had changed. Doors led to different rooms, hallways turned back on themselves, and staircases led to nowhere. I was trapped in a labyrinthine version of my own home, where each turn brought more grotesque alterations of my reality. Desperate, I found myself in what should have been the spare room, but was now a library filled with books that seemed to whisper and murmur among themselves. On a desk lay a large open tome. The words on its pages shifted and changed before my eyes, but one phrase stood out, clear and stable to escape the nightmare: confront the heart. Confused but lacking any better options, I took this cryptic advice as a directive. The heart had to be somewhere central, somewhere important. I thought of the living room, the heart of most homes, where families gather. As I made my way back downstairs, the house seemed to resist me, corridors narrowing and stretching to disorient me. Finally reaching the living room, I saw that the fireplace, which I hadn't lit in weeks, was ablaze with a fierce fire. The flames danced and twisted, casting sinister shadows that played over the twisted forms of my furniture. I approached the fireplace, the heat intense, almost scalding. Standing before the fire, I spoke aloud, my voice trembling. I want to wake up. Let me go, but the fire only crackled mockingly, and the room seemed to close in around me. It was then that I noticed the mirror above the mantelpiece, the glass rippling like the surface of a pond. I stared into it, and my reflection stared back, distorted and fluid. I reached out, touching the glass, and it yielded under my fingers like gelatin. Gathering my courage, I pushed my hand further, and the surface swallowed it, pulling me in. I felt a rush of cold and heat, a sense of vertigo as if falling through endless space. Then, suddenly, I was back in my living room. Everything was normal. The couch was just a couch, the walls were stable, and the photos smiled benignly down at me. I collapsed on the floor, exhausted and bewildered, unsure if what I had experienced was real or some hallucination. Yet everything felt different now, as if I had passed through a storm and emerged into calm. The oppressive feeling was gone, replaced by a cautious relief. Over the following days, I remained wary, half expecting my reality to distort again. But my home remained just that, a home, not a nightmarish labyrinth. I never found an explanation for what happened. Perhaps it was a waking dream, a psychological break under stress, or maybe, just maybe, my house had tested me, a sentient entity using fear to communicate. Whatever the truth, I learned to pay closer attention to my surroundings, to appreciate the normalcy of my daily life. And though I occasionally glanced nervously at the mirror above the fireplace, thankful for its still and silent surface, I also felt a newfound respect for the unknown depths behind the reflection, for the distorted reality that had once opened its doors to me. Story 20. It all started with a simple weekend trip to a local flea market. I was meandering among the stalls filled with antiques and oddities when a particular painting caught my eye. It depicted an eerie, moonlit landscape, a dark forest with gnarled trees, under a sky heavy with swirling clouds. In the foreground was a figure, cloaked in shadow, facing away but turning slightly, as if just about to reveal their face. The artistry was impressive, the scene compellingly sinister, and I felt drawn to it inexplicably. Without much thought, I purchased the painting and took it home. The first night it hung on my wall, everything seemed normal. But that night my dreams took a terrifying turn. I dreamt I was standing in the forest depicted in the painting, the darkness around me alive with whispering winds. The figure from the painting was there too, just out of clear sight, always in the periphery of my vision. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, and as the dream progressed, the figure seemed to beckon me closer. Just as it turned to reveal its face, I would wake up, heart pounding, with the unsettling feeling of being watched. Each consecutive night, the dreams grew more vivid. The figure began to reach out to me, its hands stretched forth with a desperate, menacing intent. I would wake up just as it seemed to grasp me, pulling me towards the dark world within the canvas. I started to dread falling asleep, the painting's image haunting me even in daylight. I began researching the painting, hoping to find something about its origin or artist that might explain my disturbing dreams. But there was nothing to be found, not in online databases, not in library archives, not from the flea market vendor who shrugged helplessly when I returned to ask. Driven by a growing sense of desperation, I consulted a local psychic known for her expertise with cursed objects. She agreed to examine the painting. The moment she entered my home, she stiffened, a look of concern spreading across her face as she stared at the painting. "This piece," she whispered, "is imbued with dark energy. It's not just a painting, it's a portal, a gateway that the figure in the painting uses to reach into this world. It feeds on fear, and it's latching onto you." The psychic's words sent chills down my spine. She advised me to remove the painting from my home immediately, but I feared damaging or losing it might anger whatever entity was attached to it. Instead, she performed a cleansing ritual, using salt and sage, chanting incantations I did not understand. She then placed protective talismans around my home and gave me a small amulet to wear at all times. For a few nights it seemed to work. My sleep was undisturbed, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, and I began to feel a cautious relief. But then, the dreams returned, more aggressive than ever. The figure was no longer content to lurk in the shadows. It now pursued me, its face still obscured, its intentions unmistakably malevolent. I would run through the dark forest, the ground beneath me uneven and treacherous, until I would inevitably stumble and fall. Just as the figure reached for me, I'd wake up in a cold sweat. Convinced that the psychic's measures were only a temporary fix, I decided to take more drastic action. I took the painting to a remote area, a clearing in the woods far from my home, where I intended to destroy it. Armed with a can of gasoline and matches, I stood before the painting, which was propped against a tree. The figure in the painting seemed to watch me, its presence almost palpable in the cold air. As I poured the gasoline over the canvas, the air around me grew chillier, the atmosphere heavier. I struck a match and threw it onto the painting. It caught fire instantly, the flames consuming the fabric and frame with a fierce intensity. As the fire burned, a howl filled the air, a sound so filled with rage and despair that I covered my ears, my own screams mingling with it. When the fire died down, all that was left was ash and charred wood. I buried the remains right there in the clearing, hoping to seal away the malevolent spirit forever. Exhausted and shaken, I returned home, praying that the nightmare was finally over. That night I slept peacefully, and for many nights after. The dreams ceased, and slowly, life returned to normal. Sometimes I would catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure from the painting, but it never appeared. The psychic checked in occasionally, pleased with the outcome and confident that the entity was gone. Months passed without incident. Then, one day, while visiting another town, I passed by a small art gallery. In the window, a painting caught my eye. It was a serene landscape, much different from the cursed painting I had destroyed. Yet, as I looked closer, a chill ran through me. There, in the corner of the painting, almost hidden in the shadows, was a figure, the same figure, its face finally visible, staring out with hollow, accusing eyes. I walked away quickly, my heart racing. The realization dawned on me that perhaps the entity wasn't bound to just one painting or one place. Perhaps it was something more, something that could never truly be destroyed. Now I avoid art galleries and stray away from paintings that remind me even remotely of that dark forest and its sinister inhabitant. But the fear remains a constant companion, whispering that some doors, once opened, might never be closed again. Story 21. As the sun dipped behind the towering pines, casting elongated shadows across the forest floor, I ventured deeper into the wilderness, eager to explore the secrets hidden within the ancient woods. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles, and the only sound was the crunch of dry leaves beneath my hiking boots. I had always found solace in nature, and today was no exception. Yet, as I trekked further into the heart of the forest, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. It was as if I were being watched, as if unseen eyes were tracking my every move. At first, I dismissed the sensation as nothing more than nerves. After all, I was alone in the wilderness, miles away from civilization. But as I continued along the narrow trail, the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. Then, just as the last rays of sunlight faded into darkness, I heard the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the trees. My heart skipped a beat as I froze in place, straining to listen for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Only the eerie silence of the forest enveloped me like a heavy cloak. Brushing off my unease, I convinced myself that it was simply my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, there were no other hikers for miles around. With a nervous chuckle, I resumed my hike, quickening my pace in an attempt to shake off the lingering sense of unease. Yet, no matter how fast I walked, the footsteps seemed to follow, growing louder with each passing moment. I tried to convince myself that it was just an echo, bouncing off the trees and distorting the sound. But deep down I knew that wasn't the case. Someone or something was out there, lurking in the shadows just beyond my line of sight. As the darkness deepened, I began to feel a sense of dread creeping over me. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent shivers down my spine. It was as if the forest itself had come alive, its ancient inhabitants watching my every move with unseen eyes. Desperate to escape the oppressive silence, I called out into the darkness, hoping to break the spell that seemed to hold me captive. But my voice only seemed to add to the eerie atmosphere, echoing through the trees like a ghostly whisper. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. With a gasp, I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest as I searched the darkness for any sign of life. But there was nothing, Only the empty expanse of the forest stretched out before me, silent and still as the grave. Trembling, I took a hesitant step forward, my senses on high alert as I continued along the trail. Yet, no matter how far I walked, the footsteps never seemed to fade. They followed me like a shadow, a constant reminder that I was not alone in the wilderness. And with each passing moment, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, until it was almost suffocating in its intensity. As the night wore on, I began to lose track of time, the darkness closing in around me like a suffocating blanket. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow seemed to conceal some hidden threat waiting to pounce. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw a pair of glowing eyes staring out at me from the darkness. With a cry of fear, I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding in my chest as I struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized that the eyes belonged to a deer, its gaze fixed on me with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Relief flooded through me as I realized that I had been imagining things all along, that there was no one or nothing out there watching me. With a shaky laugh, I continued along the trail, the sense of unease slowly dissipating with each step. Yet, even as I put distance between myself and the mysterious footsteps, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something unseen was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. And as I disappeared into the darkness, the sound of footsteps faded into nothingness, leaving me to wonder if I had truly been alone in the wilderness, or if something else had been watching me all along. Story 22. Once upon a time, in a quaint little town nestled between towering mountains and whispering forests, there stood an ancient library. Its weathered stone walls held secrets of centuries past, and its shelves groaned under the weight of forgotten tomes. Among these dusty volumes there lay a book unlike any other, a book whispered to be cursed, its pages teeming with tales that seemed to breathe with a life of their own. It was a cold, dreary evening when I stumbled upon this mysterious tome. The library was deserted, save for the faint flicker of candlelight that danced across the rows of books. As I wandered the aisles, my fingers trailed along the spines, seeking something to capture my imagination. And then, there it was, nestled between two ancient volumes, its cover worn and its pages yellowed with age. The title, embossed in faded gold lettering, read simply "The Haunted Book." Intrigued, I carefully lifted it from the shelf, feeling a strange tingling sensation course through my fingertips. With trembling hands, I opened the book and began to read. The first story was a chilling tale of a ghostly apparition that haunted the halls of an abandoned mansion. As I read, I felt a shiver run down my spine, as though the icy fingers of the specter were reaching out to me from the pages themselves. And then, suddenly I heard a faint whisper in the air, so soft that it seemed to be little more than the rustle of the leaves outside the library windows. I shook my head, trying to dispel the eerie feeling that had settled over me, and turned the page. The next story was even more unsettling, a tale of a cursed painting that trapped the souls of those who dared to gaze upon it. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I read, each word drawing me deeper into the twisted world that the author had created. But still, I could not tear myself away. The stories seemed to have a life of their own, weaving themselves around me like a spider's web, trapping me in their grasp. I tried to close the book to break free from its hold, but my hands refused to obey me. It was as though some unseen force was compelling me to keep reading, to delve ever deeper into the darkness that lurked within its pages. As the night wore on, I lost all sense of time and space, lost in a haze of fear and fascination. Each story was more terrifying than the last, each one drawing me further into the depths of despair. I felt as though I were drowning, suffocating beneath the weight of the book's malevolent power. And then, just when I thought I could bear it no longer, I reached the final page. With a trembling hand, I turned it over, half expecting to find some dreadful creature lurking in the shadows beyond. But to my surprise, there was nothing there. The page was blank, save for a single sentence scrawled in elegant script. The true horror lies not in the tales we read, but in the darkness that lurks within our own hearts. With a gasp, I slammed the book shut, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. The spell had been broken, the curse lifted. I stumbled out of the library, blinking in the harsh light of the moon, feeling as though I had just awoken from a terrible nightmare. But even as I walked away, I could not shake the feeling that the book still lingered in the shadows, waiting for its next unsuspecting victim. And I wondered, with a shiver of dread, if I would ever truly be free from its haunting grip. Story 23. In the dim light of my bathroom, I stood before the mirror, ready to begin my nightly routine. But as I stared into the glass, something seemed off. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was as if my reflection were slightly distorted, like a funhouse mirror that twisted reality just enough to be unsettling. I shook my head, chiding myself for letting my imagination run wild. After all, mirrors play tricks on us all the time, especially in the dim light of evening. But as I continued to study my reflection, a chill ran down my spine. There was something wrong with my reflection. It wasn't just a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. No, this was something far more sinister. At first, it was subtle, a wrinkle here, a gray hair there. But as I watched in horror, my reflection began to age rapidly before my eyes. Deep lines etched themselves into my skin, my hair turned brittle and gray, and my eyes sank into hollow sockets. I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared in disbelief at the decrepit figure staring back at me from the mirror. It was as if I were watching myself grow old in a matter of seconds, decades passing in the blink of an eye. Terrified, I reached out a trembling hand, desperate to touch the glass and prove to myself that this was just a nightmare. But as my fingertips brushed against the cool surface, the reflection reached out as well, its bony fingers curling around mine with a grip like ice. With a cry of fear, I recoiled, stumbling backwards and tripping over the edge of the bath mat. I landed hard on the tile floor, the breath knocked out of me as I scrambled to my feet and fled the bathroom. The image of my aging reflection burned into my mind like a brand. For hours, I paced the halls of my darkened apartment, unable to shake the image of my decrepit reflection from my mind. Every shadow seemed to conceal some hidden threat, every creak of the floorboards sending shivers down my spine. But no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the memory of what I had seen in the mirror. It haunted my every thought, twisting and distorting reality until I could no longer trust my own senses. In a fit of panic, I grabbed a hammer from the toolbox in the closet and stormed back into the bathroom, determined to rid myself of the cursed mirror once and for all. Without hesitation, I raised the hammer high above my head and brought it crashing down onto the glass, shattering it into 1,000 jagged shards. For a moment, there was only silence, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. But then, as the dust settled and I stared at the shattered remains of the mirror strewn across the floor, I realized with horror that my reflection was still there, staring back at me with empty eyes from every fractured piece. With a cry of despair, I stumbled backwards, the hammer slipping from my grasp as I collapsed to the ground in a heap. How could this be happening? I had destroyed the mirror, shattered it into 1,000 pieces, and yet my reflection remained, mocking me from every shard like a twisted echo of my own fear. As the minutes turned into hours, I lay there in the darkness, consumed by a sense of hopelessness, unlike anything I had ever known. It was as if the mirror had stolen something from me, something vital and irreplaceable, leaving me hollow and empty inside. And then, just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, I heard a voice, a whisper so soft that it was barely more than a breath of air. "Look at yourself," it said, echoing through the empty room like a ghostly refrain. With trembling hands, I forced myself to sit up, my eyes fixed on the shattered remains of the mirror lying scattered across the floor. And as I stared at my reflection, fractured and distorted though it was, I realized with a jolt of horror that it was changing once again. But this time it wasn't aging. No, it was something far worse. With each passing moment, my reflection grew darker, more twisted and grotesque until it no longer resembled me at all. It was as if I were staring into the face of some malevolent entity, a creature born from the depths of my own nightmares. With a cry of horror, I scrambled to my feet and fled the bathroom, the echo of my own terrified screams following me down the hallway like a specter of doom. And as I stumbled into the darkness of my apartment, I knew with a sickening certainty that the sinister reflection would haunt me for the rest of my days, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked within. Story 24. The whispers in the wind. I heard faint whispers carried on the wind, speaking of long-forgotten secrets and hidden truths, but when I tried to follow their source, they vanished without a trace. It was a warm summer afternoon, the kind of day when the air hangs heavy with the scent of blooming flowers and the promise of adventure. I was sitting on the porch of my family's old farmhouse, idly flipping through the pages of a book, when I first heard them, the whispers. At first I thought it was just the breeze rustling through the trees, playing tricks on my ears. But as I listened more closely, I realized that the sound was coming from somewhere beyond the edge of the forest that bordered our property. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there a soft murmur, like the murmuring of voices carried on the wind. Intrigued, I set down my book and rose from my chair, straining to catch the words that floated tantalizingly just out of reach. They seemed to be calling to me, beckoning me to follow them into the depths of the woods. Without a second thought, I set off, the whispers growing louder with each step I took. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the trees closed in around me, casting long shadows that danced in the dappled sunlight. The air grew cooler, tinged with the scent of damp earth and moss, and still, the whispers continued, guiding me ever onward. I lost track of time as I followed the elusive sound, my senses heightened with anticipation. It was as though I were being drawn towards some ancient secret, hidden deep within the heart of the forest. But just as I felt myself drawing closer to the source of the whispers, they suddenly ceased, leaving nothing but an eerie silence in their wake. Confused and disoriented, I halted in my tracks, scanning the dense undergrowth for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, no trace of the mysterious voices that had led me here. It was as though they had vanished into thin air, leaving me standing alone in the midst of the silent forest. For a moment, I considered turning back, returning to the safety of the farmhouse, and putting the strange encounter behind me. But something inside me urged me to press on, to unravel the mystery of the whispers once and for all. With a determined nod, I forged ahead, pushing deeper into the forest with each passing moment. Hours seemed to pass as I wandered through the tangled underbrush, my mind consumed with thoughts of the secrets that lay hidden just out of reach. And then, just when I was beginning to lose hope, I stumbled upon a clearing bathed in golden sunlight. At its center stood an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like outstretched fingers. And there, beneath its sprawling canopy, I saw her, a figure cloaked in shadow, her face obscured by the tangled strands of her hair. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what I would find. But as I drew nearer, the figure turned to face me, her eyes gleaming with a strange, otherworldly light. "You have come," she whispered, her voice soft and melodious. "You have followed the whispers, just as I knew you would." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, I simply nodded, my gaze locked with hers in a silent exchange of understanding. "Come," she said, extending a hand toward me. "There is much I have to show you." And with that, she led me deeper into the heart of the forest, where the whispers of the wind carried secrets untold and hidden truths awaited those brave enough to seek them out. Story 25. The night was dark and silent, the kind of silence that seemed to press in on you from all sides, suffocating and oppressive. I lay in bed, tossing and turning, unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me like a heavy blanket. It was then that I felt a cold hand brushing against mine in the darkness. At first, I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I struggled to comprehend what had just happened. Was it just my imagination running wild in the dead of night, or had something truly touched me? With trembling hands, I fumbled for the bedside lamp, my heart racing as I prepared to flood the room with light. But as the soft glow illuminated the darkness, I saw that there was no one there, no intruder lurking in the shadows, no ghostly apparition reaching out from beyond the grave. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe a sigh of relief, chiding myself for letting my imagination get the better of me. After all, it was just a cold draft or a trick of the mind, nothing more. But even as I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, a nagging sense of doubt lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that unseen eyes were tracking my every move from the shadows. With a shiver, I pulled the covers tighter around me, desperate to block out the chill that seemed to seep into my bones. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of that cold hand brushing against mine in the darkness. As the night wore on, I drifted in and out of fitful sleep, my dreams haunted by visions of ghostly figures reaching out to me from the darkness. Each time I woke, I found myself bathed in a cold sweat, my heart racing in my chest as I struggled to separate reality from nightmare. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I felt it again, the cold touch of a hand brushing against mine in the darkness. This time, there was no denying it. It was real, a tangible presence that sent shivers down my spine. With a cry of fear, I leaped out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest, as I frantically searched the room for any sign of an intruder. But there was nothing, only the empty expanse of my bedroom, silent and still as the grave. Desperate for answers, I tore through the room, searching every nook and cranny for some clue as to what had just happened. But try as I might, I couldn't find anything out of the ordinary, no hidden passageways, no secret compartments, nothing that could explain the phantom hand that had touched mine in the darkness. Defeated, I sank to the floor, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was it a ghost, reaching out from beyond the grave to make contact with the living? Or was it something far more sinister, a malevolent force lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts from my mind. After all, dwelling on the unknown would only drive me further into madness. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. With a heavy heart, I climbed back into bed, pulling the covers tightly around me as I tried to block out the cold that seemed to seep into my bones. But even as I closed my eyes and tried to drift off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that gnawed at my insides like a hungry beast. And as the darkness closed in around me, I couldn't help but wonder, would the phantom hand return to haunt me once more? Or was it just a figment of my imagination, destined to fade into nothingness with the light of day? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain, I would never forget the chilling touch of that cold hand brushing against mine in the darkness. Story 26. In the attic of my grandmother's old Victorian house, Among dusty trunks and forgotten treasures, I stumbled upon a relic from a bygone era, a music box. It lay nestled in a corner, its once vibrant colors faded with age, its delicate figurines frozen in a timeless dance. Intrigued by its antiquated charm, I reached out and gently lifted it from its resting place, a thrill of excitement coursing through me. As I wound the key, the music box sprang to life, its delicate melody filling the air with a haunting beauty that sent shivers down my spine. It was unlike any tune I had ever heard, ethereal and mournful, yet strangely captivating. Each note seemed to echo with a sense of longing, as if calling out to something hidden deep within the shadows. Night after night, I found myself drawn to the music box, unable to resist the pull of its enchanting melody. As the rest of the house slumbered in silence, I would sit alone in the dim light of my grandmother's attic, lost in the haunting strains of its song. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to notice something peculiar. The music box only played its eerie melody after the stroke of midnight. It was as though it were beckoning to me from the darkness, luring me into its mysterious embrace with each haunting note. At first, I dismissed it as nothing more than a coincidence, a figment of my overactive imagination. But as the nights wore on, I could no longer deny the truth. There was something unnatural about the music box, something sinister that defied explanation. Determined to uncover the truth, I delved into the history of the house, scouring old newspapers and dusty archives for any mention of the music box and its origins. What I discovered chilled me to the core. It turned out that the music box had once belonged to a young girl who had lived in the house many years ago. Legend had it that she had been a talented musician, gifted with a voice that could move even the coldest of hearts. But her life had been cut tragically short, her dreams shattered by a cruel twist of fate. According to the stories, the girl's spirit still lingered within the walls of the house, her restless soul bound to the music box that had once brought her so much joy. And it was said that every night she would play her haunting melody, searching for someone to set her free from the chains of her eternal torment. Armed with this newfound knowledge, I knew I had to confront the truth once and for all. With a mixture of fear and determination, I waited until the witching hour had arrived, the darkness pressing in around me like a suffocating cloak. As the clock struck midnight, the music box began to play, its haunting melody echoing through the empty halls of the house. With trembling hands, I reached out and grasped it tightly, feeling a strange energy pulsing beneath my fingertips. "Who are you?" I whispered into the darkness, my voice barely more than a hoarse whisper. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the mournful strains of the music box's song. And then, a voice, a soft, ethereal whisper that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. "I am the girl who once lived here," it said, its words echoing in the stillness of the night. "Trapped within the confines of this cursed music box, unable to find peace until my song is heard." My heart pounding in my chest, I listened as the girl recounted her tragic tale, the dreams she had once harbored, the love she had lost, the darkness that had consumed her soul. And with each word I felt a pang of sympathy for the spirit trapped within the music box, a longing to set her free from her eternal prison. But as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I knew that time was running out. With a newfound sense of resolve, I vowed to help the girl find peace, to break the curse that bound her to the music box once and for all. With the help of a local medium, we conducted a séance, calling out to the spirit of the girl and offering her a chance to move on to the next world. And as the final notes of the music box's melody faded into silence, I felt a sense of release wash over me, as though a heavy weight had been lifted from my shoulders. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house seemed to change, as though a dark cloud had been lifted from its halls. And though the music box remained silent, its haunting melody forever etched into my memory, I knew that the girl's spirit had finally found the peace she had been searching for. As I packed my bags to leave the old Victorian house behind, I couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness mingled with relief. The music box may have been silent now, but its haunting melody would forever linger in the corners of my mind, a reminder of the mysteries that lurked within the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. Story 27. The sun hung low in the sky as I stumbled upon the deserted town, its once bustling streets now eerily silent and still. It was as if time itself had come to a standstill, freezing the town in a moment of forgotten history. I stood on the outskirts, gazing at the crumbling buildings and overgrown streets with a mixture of awe and trepidation. What had happened here? Why had the inhabitants abandoned their homes, leaving behind nothing but empty shells of the lives they once lived? With a sense of curiosity driving me forward, I stepped cautiously onto the cracked pavement, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty streets like a mournful lament. There was something hauntingly beautiful about the town, its faded facades and weathered structures bearing witness to a bygone era. As I wandered deeper into the heart of the town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was as if unseen eyes were tracking my every move, following me from the shadows as I explored the deserted streets. At first, I tried to dismiss the feeling as nothing more than my imagination running wild in the silence of the abandoned town. After all, there was no one else around for miles, no one to watch me as I wandered through the empty streets. But as I continued to explore, the feeling only grew stronger, until it was almost suffocating in its intensity. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of leaves sent shivers down my spine, as if some unseen presence lurked just beyond my line of sight. With a sense of unease gnawing at my insides, I quickened my pace, eager to escape the oppressive silence of the deserted town. But no matter how fast I walked, the feeling of being watched persisted, a constant reminder that I was not alone in this forgotten corner of the world. As I turned a corner, I stumbled upon a decrepit church, its weathered spire reaching towards the sky like a skeletal finger pointing the way to salvation. Intrigued, I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside, the musty scent of decay filling my nostrils as I crossed the threshold. The interior was bathed in shadow, the dim light filtering through stained glass windows casting colorful patterns on the worn pews and cracked stone floor. It was a solemn and sacred space, untouched by the passage of time, a relic of a forgotten era. As I explored the interior of the church, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. It was as if the very walls themselves were watching me, their silent sentinels bearing witness to my every move. With a sense of mounting dread, I turned to leave, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the abandoned church. But as I reached for the door, I felt a cold hand brush against mine, sending shivers down my spine. With a cry of fear, I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding in my chest as I searched the shadows for any sign of an intruder. But there was nothing, only the empty expanse of the church, silent and still as the grave. Trembling, I fled the church, the feeling of being watched following me like a specter as I raced through the deserted streets. It was as if the very town itself had come alive, its silent inhabitants watching my every move with unseen eyes. As I reached the edge of the town, I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the ghostly figures of the town's former inhabitants emerging from the shadows to claim me as one of their own. But there was nothing, only the empty streets and crumbling buildings, frozen in time like a forgotten memory. With a shudder, I turned away, eager to leave the deserted town and its haunting mysteries behind me. But as I disappeared into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that the town would always be a part of me, its silent streets and crumbling buildings etched into my memory like a ghostly echo of the past. Story 28. In the age of digital photography, capturing the perfect moment has become easier than ever before. But what happens when the perfect moment captures something unexpected, something chilling and otherworldly? This was a question I found myself grappling with after a seemingly innocuous photograph I took turned into a nightmare I couldn't escape. It all began on a crisp autumn afternoon, when the golden hues of the setting sun cast a warm glow over the tranquil countryside. I had decided to take a leisurely stroll through the nearby woods, my camera slung over my shoulder, eager to capture the beauty of the changing seasons. As I wandered among the towering trees and carpet of fallen leaves, my lens drank in the sights and sounds of nature in all its glory. Every rustle of the wind, every chirp of a bird, seemed to beckon me further into the heart of the forest, urging me to explore its hidden depths. And then I saw a clearing bathed in a soft, ethereal light, a perfect tableau of autumnal splendor. Without hesitation, I raised my camera and snapped a photograph, the click of the shutter echoing through the stillness of the woods. But as I lowered my camera and reviewed the image on the screen, a chill ran down my spine. There, lurking in the background, was a figure, a ghostly apparition with hollow eyes and a twisted grin, its gaze fixed on me with a malevolent glare. I blinked in disbelief, convinced that it was nothing more than a trick of the light or a smudge on the lens. But as I zoomed in on the image, I realized with a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach that it was all too real. Panic began to rise within me as I fumbled with the buttons on my camera, desperately trying to delete the photograph and erase all evidence of the sinister figure lurking within. But no matter how many times I pressed the delete button, the image refused to disappear. It was as though the ghostly presence had embedded itself into the very fabric of the digital file, defying all attempts to banish it from existence. Frustrated and unnerved, I decided to seek help from a friend who was more knowledgeable about technology than I was. Together, we spent hours poring over the photograph, analyzing every pixel in search of an explanation for the ghostly figure that haunted it. But try as we might, we could find no rational explanation for its presence. It was as though the photograph had captured something beyond the realm of human understanding, something that defied logic and reason. As days turned into weeks, the photograph continued to haunt me, its ghostly presence looming over my every waking moment. I found myself consumed by an overwhelming sense of dread, as though the malevolent gaze of the figure in the photograph was following me wherever I went. Unable to bear the weight of its sinister presence any longer, I made the decision to seek out someone who might have experience with the paranormal. After scouring the internet for hours, I finally came across the name of a renowned psychic medium who claimed to have helped countless individuals rid themselves of unwanted spiritual attachments. With a mixture of hope and trepidation, I reached out to the medium and arranged to meet them at their secluded cottage on the outskirts of town. As I made my way through the winding forest paths that led to their home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that unseen eyes were following my every move. When I finally arrived at the medium's cottage, I was greeted by a sense of calm that washed over me like a warm embrace. The medium welcomed me inside, their gentle voice soothing my frayed nerves as they listened to my tale of the haunted photograph. After studying the image carefully, the medium's brow furrowed in concentration, their fingers tracing the outline of the ghostly figure that lurked within. And then, with a solemn expression, they revealed the truth behind its presence. "It is a restless spirit," they explained, their voice low and somber. "A soul trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead, unable to find peace until its unfinished business has been resolved." With their guidance, I embarked on a journey to uncover the truth behind the ghostly figure in the photograph, delving into the history of the forest and the secrets it held. And as I unearthed long-buried truths and uncovered forgotten mysteries, I felt the oppressive weight of the ghostly presence begin to lift, its malevolent glare fading into the mists of memory. In the end, it was not technology or logic that banished the spirit from my life, but the power of understanding and empathy. And though the photograph remains a haunting reminder of the ordeal I endured, it also serves as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of the unknown. Story 29. The old church stood nestled among the trees, its weathered stone walls bearing the scars of centuries gone by. As I stepped through the rusted iron gates and into the overgrown courtyard, a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy cloak. There was something hauntingly beautiful about the abandoned church, its crumbling facade hinting at a forgotten past steeped in mystery and shadow. Curiosity driving me forward, I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside, the musty scent of decay filling my nostrils as I crossed the threshold. The interior of the church was bathed in shadow, the dim light filtering through stained glass windows casting colorful patterns on the worn pews and cracked stone floor. As I wandered deeper into the heart of the church, I stumbled upon a series of strange symbols carved into the walls. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before, intricate and cryptic, their meaning lost to time. Intrigued, I reached out a hand to touch the weathered stone, tracing the lines of the symbols with my fingertips. As I studied the symbols, I felt a sense of foreboding wash over me, as if they held the key to a dark secret buried deep within the heart of the church. There was something unsettling about the way they seemed to pulsate with an otherworldly energy, as if they were alive with some ancient power waiting to be unleashed. With a sense of trepidation, I began to decipher the symbols, tracing their intricate lines with a sense of reverence and awe. Each stroke of my finger revealed new layers of meaning, each curve and angle hinting at a deeper truth hidden just beyond my grasp. But the more I studied the symbols, the more I felt myself being drawn into their enigmatic embrace. It was as if they were speaking to me, whispering secrets of a forgotten past that had long been buried beneath the sands of time. As I delved deeper into the meaning of the symbols, I felt a sense of dread creeping over me, as if I were treading on forbidden ground. There was something inherently sinister about the way they seemed to dance and sway in the flickering candlelight, their ancient power awakening with each passing moment. And then, just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, I heard a voice's soft, melodic whisper that seemed to echo through the darkness like a ghostly refrain. "Beware," it said, its words echoing in the empty spaces of the church like a warning from beyond the grave. With a cry of fear, I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding in my chest as I searched the shadows for any sign of an intruder. But there was nothing, only the empty expanse of the church, silent and still as the grave. Trembling, I turned away from the symbols, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the abandoned church. But as I reached for the door, I felt a cold hand brush against mine, sending shivers down my spine. With a gasp, I whirled around, my eyes widening in horror as I beheld the figure standing before me. It was cloaked in shadow, its features obscured by darkness, but I could sense its malevolent presence lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. With a trembling voice, I demanded to know who or what it was, but the figure only chuckled darkly in response. "You have unlocked the secrets of the symbols," it said, its voice echoing through the darkness like a death knell. "But know this, with knowledge comes power, and with power comes great danger." With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realized that I had stumbled upon something far more sinister than I had ever imagined. The symbols were not just random carvings etched into the walls of the church, they were a gateway to a dark and forbidden realm, a realm that I had unwittingly unlocked with my curiosity. As the figure stepped closer, its form shimmering in the dim light of the church, I knew that I had to escape, to flee from this place before it consumed me whole. With a cry of fear, I turned and ran, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty halls of the church like a desperate plea for salvation. But even as I fled into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the symbols would always be a part of me, their cryptic meaning etched into my soul like a curse from which I could never escape. And as I disappeared into the darkness, I knew that the secrets of the old church would forever haunt me, a reminder of the dangers that lurked just beyond the edges of our reality. Story 30. The night was dark and still, the moon hanging low in the sky like a pale, silent sentinel. I lay in bed, the covers pulled tightly around me as I drifted in and out of a fitful sleep. Outside, the world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. And then, in the darkness just beyond my window, I saw a shadowy figure lurking among the trees, its form barely discernible against the inky blackness of the night. My heart skipped a beat as I watched, frozen in terror as the figure moved with a fluid grace, its movements silent and swift. For a moment I convinced myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, a trick of the light or a figment of my restless mind. But as I watched, the figure seemed to solidify, its features becoming clearer with each passing moment. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, twin points of light that seemed to pierce through the night like beacons of malevolent intent. With a shudder, I realized that I was not imagining things. There was someone or something lurking outside my window, watching me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. With a trembling hand, I reached for the bedside lamp, my fingers fumbling for the switch as I struggled to banish the darkness that seemed to press in on me from all sides. But when the light flooded the room, the figure was gone, vanished into the night like a ghostly wraith. I sat there in the silence of my room, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. Who or what was that shadowy figure, and what did it want with me? As the minutes ticked by, I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by a passing car, or a trick of the wind rustling through the trees. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. There was something inherently sinister about the figure lurking outside my window, something that sent a chill down my spine just thinking about it. With a sense of dread gnawing at my insides, I rose from my bed and crossed the room to peer out the window, half expecting to see the figure waiting for me in the darkness. But there was nothing, only the empty expanse of my backyard, silent and still as the grave. Trembling, I closed the curtains and retreated back to bed, the feeling of being watched following me like a shadow as I pulled the covers tightly around me. For hours, I lay there in the darkness, unable to shake the memory of those gleaming eyes staring at me from the night. And then, just as I was beginning to drift off to sleep, I heard a soft scratching at the window, like fingernails scraping against glass. With a gasp, I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest as I listened to the sound echoing through the silent room. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Should I investigate the source of the sound, or should I stay hidden beneath the safety of my covers, praying that whatever lurked outside would go away? With a sense of dread pooling in the pit of my stomach, I rose from my bed and crossed the room to peer out the window once more. And there, standing just beyond the glass, was the shadowy figure, its eyes gleaming in the darkness as it stared back at me with a hunger that sent chills down my spine. With a cry of fear, I stumbled backwards, my heart racing in my chest as I struggled to comprehend what was happening. How had the figure returned, and what did it want with me? Desperate for answers, I flung open the window and leaned out into the night, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the figure. But there was nothing, only the empty expanse of my backyard, silent and still as the grave. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanished into the night like a phantom. With a trembling hand, I closed the window and retreated back to bed, the memory of those gleaming eyes burning into my mind like a brand. For the rest of the night, I lay awake in the darkness, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. Who or what was that shadowy figure, and what did it want with me? As the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, I knew that I would never forget the terror of that night, or the sinister presence that lurked just beyond the edges of my reality. Story 31. In the heart of the bustling city, nestled among a row of quaint antique shops, there stood one that seemed to beckon to me, a dusty haven of forgotten treasures and hidden gems. It was there, among the cobweb-covered shelves and shadowy corners, that I stumbled upon a discovery that would forever change my life: a haunted dollhouse. The miniature replica of my own house sat perched on a shelf near the back of the shop, its faded paint and weathered facade hinting at the passage of time. Intrigued by its uncanny resemblance to my own home, I reached out and gently lifted it from its resting place, a thrill of excitement coursing through me. As I examined the tiny details, the miniature furniture, the intricately painted walls, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about the dollhouse. It was as though it held a secret, a hidden darkness that lurked beneath its charming exterior. Ignoring the warning signs that whispered in the back of my mind, I purchased the dollhouse and brought it home, eager to explore its mysteries further. But as the days passed and I began to uncover its secrets, I realized that I had unearthed something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. It started innocently enough. The tiny figures that populated the dollhouse seemed to move when I wasn't looking, their positions shifting ever so slightly each time I glanced away. At first I dismissed it as a trick of the light or my overactive imagination, but as the phenomena persisted, I began to suspect that there was something more sinister at play. Each night, as I lay in bed, I would hear the sound of tiny footsteps echoing through the halls of the dollhouse, accompanied by the soft murmur of voices that seemed to whisper secrets to one another in the darkness. Terrified yet strangely fascinated, I would creep downstairs to investigate, only to find the dollhouse exactly as I had left it, silent and still, its inhabitants frozen in time. But as the days turned into weeks, the activity within the dollhouse began to escalate. Objects would go missing, only to reappear in the most unlikely of places. Strange shadows danced across the walls, their movements erratic and unpredictable. And then one night, I awoke to find the tiny figures gathered in a circle, their faces contorted into expressions of malice and madness. I knew then that I had to confront the darkness that lurked within the dollhouse, to uncover the truth behind its haunted facade. With trembling hands, I reached out and opened the tiny door, peering inside with trepidation. What I saw within sent a shiver down my spine, a twisted reflection of my own home, its walls lined with faded wallpaper and its floors littered with debris. But it was the figures that inhabited this miniature world that filled me with dread, tiny replicas of myself and my family, their eyes glazed over with an otherworldly light. As I watched in horror, the figures began to move, their movements jerky and unnatural. It was as though they were being controlled by some unseen force, a malevolent presence that sought to twist and distort their very essence. With a cry of desperation, I slammed the door shut, hoping to banish the darkness back into the depths of the dollhouse once and for all. But even as I did, I could feel its malevolent presence lingering in the air, a tangible reminder of the evil that lurked within. Determined to rid myself of the haunted dollhouse once and for all, I sought out the help of a renowned paranormal investigator, a man whose expertise in matters of the supernatural was unmatched. Together, we delved into the history of the dollhouse, uncovering a trail of tragedy and despair that stretched back centuries. It turned out that the dollhouse had once belonged to a wealthy family who had met a grisly end under mysterious circumstances. Legend had it that their spirits still haunted the dollhouse, trapped within its walls for all eternity. Armed with this knowledge, we performed a ritual to cleanse the dollhouse of its malevolent presence, calling upon the spirits of the departed to find peace and move on to the next world. And as the last echoes of our incantations faded into the night, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, as though a heavy weight had been lifted from my shoulders. In the days that followed, the dollhouse remained silent and still, its haunted inhabitants at long last laid to rest. And though I could never forget the horrors that I had witnessed within its walls, I took solace in the knowledge that I had confronted the darkness head-on and emerged victorious. As for the dollhouse itself, I decided to donate it to a local museum where it could serve as a cautionary tale for those who dared to delve into the mysteries of the supernatural. And though its haunted past may never be forgotten, I knew that it would no longer hold sway over the lives of those who crossed its path. Story 32. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over the world like a heavy blanket, muffling sound and wrapping everything in a veil of stillness. I was driving home from a late shift, the empty highway stretching out before me like a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkness. As I rounded a bend in the road, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a flash of light, a blur of motion. I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see the headlights of another car approaching from behind. But there was nothing, only the empty expanse of the highway stretching out behind me, silent and still as the grave. Confused, I shook my head and turned my attention back to the road ahead, chalking it up to fatigue and my overactive imagination. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the phantom car was there again, speeding down the highway with reckless abandon, its headlights piercing through the darkness like twin beacons of light. I blinked in disbelief, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched the ghostly car tear down the highway, weaving in and out of lanes with a speed and agility that seemed impossible. It was as if the car itself were alive, a creature of the night born from the depths of my own nightmares. With a sense of growing unease, I stepped on the gas, determined to catch up to the phantom car and unravel the mystery of its existence. But no matter how fast I drove, the car always seemed to stay just out of reach, disappearing around corners and vanishing into the darkness like a wisp of smoke. Frustrated and bewildered, I slowed to a stop on the side of the road, my hands trembling on the steering wheel as I tried to make sense of what I had just witnessed. Was it a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress? Or was there something more sinister at play, something beyond the realm of rational explanation? As I sat there in the silence of the night, a sense of dread settled over me like a heavy weight, pressing down on my chest and suffocating me with its intensity. It was as if the phantom car had brought with it a darkness that threatened to consume me whole, leaving me lost and alone in a world gone mad. With a shaky breath, I reached for my phone and dialed the emergency services, my voice trembling as I tried to explain what I had seen. But even as I spoke, I knew that no one would believe me, that they would dismiss my story as nothing more than the ramblings of a tired and overworked mind. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the phantom car was gone, vanished into the night without a trace, leaving me to question my sanity and my grip on reality. With a sense of defeat, I hung up the phone and slumped back in my seat, the weight of what I had witnessed pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. For hours I sat there on the side of the road, lost in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Was the phantom car real, or had it all been a figment of my imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and stress? As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I knew that I would never forget the terror of that night, the sight of the ghostly car speeding down the highway, its headlights piercing through the darkness like twin daggers of light. And as I drove home, the memory of those fleeting moments haunted me like a ghost, a constant reminder of the fragility of reality and the darkness that lurks just beyond the edges of our perception. Story 33. In the heart of the countryside, where rolling hills met the sky and the air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, lay a forest unlike any other, the Whispering Woods. It was a place of mystery and enchantment, where the trees seemed to possess a life of their own, their branches twisting and turning like gnarled fingers reaching toward the heavens. Intrigued by the tales of the forest's whispered secrets, I set out one crisp autumn morning, determined to uncover the truth hidden within its shadowy depths. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew thick with the sound of rustling leaves and murmuring voices, as though the very trees themselves were speaking to one another in a language known only to them. At first, I dismissed the whispers as nothing more than a trick of the wind, a figment of my overactive imagination, but as I delved deeper into the forest, their voices grew louder and more insistent, echoing in my ears like the distant tolling of a bell. Unable to resist the pull of their mysterious song, I pressed on, my senses heightened with anticipation. It was as though the very air was alive with energy, crackling with the promise of hidden truths waiting to be uncovered. As I wandered among the towering trees and tangled undergrowth, I began to lose track of time, each step carrying me further into the heart of the forest and further away from the world I knew. Reality seemed to blur at the edges, the line between fantasy and truth growing increasingly thin. And then, just when I thought I could go no further, I stumbled upon a clearing bathed in golden light, a serene oasis amidst the chaos of the woods. At its center stood a towering oak tree, its branches reaching toward the sky like outstretched arms, as though beckoning me closer. As I approached, the whispers grew louder, their voices swirling around me like a whirlwind, pulling me deeper into their embrace. And then, suddenly they fell silent, leaving nothing but a heavy silence in their wake. Confused and disoriented, I looked around the clearing, searching for any sign of the source of the whispers. But there was nothing, no movement, no sound, save for the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. With a sense of unease gnawing at my insides, I turned to leave, eager to escape the oppressive stillness of the clearing. But as I took my first step, a voice's soft, melodic whisper called out to me from the shadows. "Stay," it urged, its words echoing in the stillness of the forest. "There is much I have to show you." Intrigued, I hesitated, my curiosity overriding my fear. And then, with a determined nod, I turned back toward the clearing, ready to uncover the secrets that lay hidden within its depths. As I ventured deeper into the clearing, I felt a strange energy pulsing through the air, a tangible presence that seemed to surround me on all sides. It was as though the very essence of the forest had come alive, its ancient spirit reaching out to me in a silent plea for understanding. And then suddenly the world around me shifted, the trees melting away like shadows in the night to reveal a hidden realm beyond my wildest imagination. It was a place of wonder and magic, where the laws of nature were mere suggestions and the boundaries of reality blurred into nothingness. As I gazed in awe at the beauty that surrounded me, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere, and nowhere all at once spoke to me, its words echoing in the cavernous expanse of my mind. "Welcome," it said, its tone both soothing and commanding. "Welcome to the Whispering Woods, where the secrets of the universe are whispered on the wind and the mysteries of creation are laid bare." With a sense of awe and reverence, I followed the voice deeper into the heart of the woods, my senses alive with wonder and anticipation. Each step brought me closer to enlightenment, closer to the truth that lay hidden within the forest's ancient embrace. And as I wandered among the towering trees and shimmering glades, I felt a sense of peace wash over me, a feeling of belonging that I had never experienced before. For in that moment, I knew that I had found my true home, the Whispering Woods, where the whispers of the universe echoed in the silence of the night, and the secrets of existence were revealed to those brave enough to listen. Story 34. The woods were dense and dark, the trees towering overhead like ancient sentinels guarding their secrets from prying eyes. I had been hiking for hours, following a winding trail that seemed to lead deeper and deeper into the heart of the forest. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn towards something hidden and mysterious, lurking just beyond the edges of my perception. It was as if the very woods themselves were whispering secrets to me, urging me to press forward and discover what lay hidden within their depths. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I stumbled upon a hidden clearing nestled among the trees, bathed in dappled sunlight and alive with the vibrant colors of 1,000 flowers in bloom. It was a sight unlike anything I had ever seen before, a secret garden hidden deep within the heart of the forest, its beauty almost otherworldly in its perfection. With a sense of wonder, I stepped into the clearing, the soft grass crunching beneath my boots as I made my way towards the flowers. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before, their petals shimmering in the sunlight, their fragrance filling the air with a heady perfume that seemed to intoxicate me with its sweetness. As I reached out to touch the nearest flower, I felt a sense of dread wash over me, as if nature itself was warning me to stay away. There was a subtle sensation, a feeling of unease that prickled at the back of my neck and sent shivers down my spine. But despite the warning, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the flowers, their beauty holding me captive like a moth drawn to a flame. With trembling hands, I reached out once more, my fingertips brushing against the delicate petals with a sense of reverence and awe. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the feeling of dread vanished, replaced by a sense of peace and tranquility, unlike anything I had ever known. It was as if the flowers themselves were reaching out to me, welcoming me into their midst with open arms. For hours I wandered through the enchanted garden, lost in a world of beauty and wonder. Each flower seemed to hold a secret, a story waiting to be told, and I drank in their fragrance and their beauty with a sense of joy that filled my heart to bursting. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon and the shadows lengthened across the forest floor, I knew that it was time to leave. Reluctantly, I turned to go, the memory of the enchanted garden burning brightly in my mind like a beacon of light in the darkness. But as I made my way back towards the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something lurking just beyond the edges of my vision, hidden among the trees. It was a feeling of unease that gnawed at the pit of my stomach, a sense of danger that I couldn't ignore. With a sense of urgency, I quickened my pace, eager to leave the enchanted garden and its mysteries behind me. But no matter how fast I walked, the feeling of being watched persisted, a constant reminder that I was not alone in the woods. And then, just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, I saw a shadowy figure lurking among the trees, its form barely discernible in the fading light of day. With a cry of fear, I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched the figure draw closer, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. Desperate to escape, I turned and ran, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the silent forest like a thunderous drumbeat. But no matter how fast I ran, the figure was always there, its presence looming over me like a specter of doom. With a sense of terror gripping my heart, I pushed myself to run faster, my lungs burning with exertion as I raced through the trees. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I burst through the trees and stumbled into the clearing, the safety of the enchanted garden stretching out before me like a welcoming embrace. With a sense of relief flooding through me, I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath as I stared up at the sky above. And as the last rays of sunlight faded into darkness, I knew that I would never forget the beauty of the enchanted garden or the danger that lurked just beyond its borders. Story 35. In the old Victorian house where I had recently moved, there was one place I avoided at all costs: the attic. From the moment I set foot in the sprawling mansion, I could sense an oppressive energy, emanating from the dusty stairs that led up to its darkened depths. Despite my best efforts to ignore it, the attic seemed to call out to me, its siren song of mystery and danger impossible to resist. And so, one fateful night, curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself ascending the creaking staircase, my heart pounding in my chest with each step. As I reached the top of the stairs, a chill ran down my spine, sending shivers cascading through my body. The air was thick with the scent of decay and neglect, the only sound the soft whisper of the wind as it whistled through the cracks in the ancient walls. But it was not the eerie silence that made my blood run cold, it was the strange noises that echoed through the darkness, like the scratching of claws against wood, or the faint murmur of voices speaking in hushed tones. Terrified yet inexplicably drawn to the source of the sounds, I pressed forward, my footsteps echoing in the empty space as I made my way across the attic floor. And then, just as I reached the center of the room, the noises stopped abruptly, leaving me standing alone in the darkness, my heart racing in my chest. For a moment I hesitated, unsure of what to do next. But then, with a trembling hand, I reached out and pulled the cord of the attic light, flooding the space with a dim, flickering glow. What I saw in that moment will haunt me forever, a figure, hunched and shadowy, lurking in the far corner of the attic, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. And as I watched in horror, it raised its head and fixed me with a gaze that sent chills down my spine. With a cry of terror, I stumbled backwards, my mind reeling with fear and disbelief. Without stopping to think, I turned and fled down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced toward the safety of my own room. Once safely locked behind the door, I collapsed onto my bed, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of what I had seen. Was it a trick of the light, or had I truly come face to face with something from beyond the grave? For hours, I lay awake in the darkness, the memory of the figure in the attic burning bright in my mind. And then, just as exhaustion threatened to claim me, I heard the sound of scratching, faint yet unmistakable, coming from the other side of the door. With a sense of dread gnawing in the pit of my stomach, I listened as the scratching grew louder and more insistent, as though whatever lurked in the darkness was trying to claw its way through the wood. Terrified beyond measure, I pressed myself against the door, praying for morning to come and banish the darkness that threatened to consume me. And as the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, the scratching stopped abruptly, leaving nothing but an eerie silence in its wake. Relieved yet still shaken, I summoned the courage to venture out of my room and make my way back up to the attic, determined to confront whatever evil lurked within its shadowy depths. But when I reached the top of the stairs and pushed open the attic door, I found nothing but an empty space, bathed in the soft glow of the morning sun. There was no sign of the figure that had haunted my dreams, no trace of the darkness that had threatened to consume me. Confused and shaken, I searched every corner of the attic, desperate for some sign of the truth. But try as I might, I could find no explanation for the strange events of the night before. With a heavy heart, I descended the stairs once more, vowing to put the memory of the haunted attic behind me and move on with my life. But deep down, I knew that the darkness that lurked within its walls would never truly be forgotten, a lingering reminder of the terrors that lie hidden just beyond the edge of our understanding.